where there are all of these processes happening internal to the head. What I want to do is argue that a post-cognitive psychology would go back to some ideas that are around where there are all these processes happening internal to the head. What I want to do is argue that a post-cognitive psychology would
and we'll go on. Yeah, yes, okay. Yes, yes, sorry.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes, okay. Please.
Thank you.
So, interestingly, to make this post-cognitive move, to move beyond the psychology that's been with us since the 1950s, we actually have to go back to ideas that were around before the emergence of cognitive psychology in behaviorist approaches to psychology, where the idea was to understand cognition, psychology, the mind, by looking at behavior in the context of its surroundings. So the key idea, I think, to this post-cognitive psychology is to understand behavior in relation to the structure of the environment, what I'm going to call affordances. And this idea of understanding behavior in relation to the environment was something that was already anticipated in psychology before the emergence of this cognitivist approach to psychology. So the interesting twist here is that in order to move beyond cognitivist psychology, we actually have to go back to ideas that are around before the emergence of cognitivist psychology. So the idea that is central to post-cognitivist psychology is already captured well by Bill Mace, when he suggested that instead of asking what's going on inside of the animal's head, we should ask what the animal's head is inside of, so what is going on in the environment around the animal, and understand cognition, the behavior of the animal in relation to its surroundings. How should we think about the environment? Well, I'm going to start from an understanding of the environment in terms of the practical differences that the environment makes to an animal's behavior. And understand those practical differences in terms of this notion of affordance, which we've already talked about a lot yesterday. My talk is going to be doing something that Vincente and Ed Banks, I think, are going to worry about a little bit. So I'm really going to be doing something quite philosophical and metaphysical. So when we get into the discussion, we can ask, well, what's the value of that actually for psychology? But I think it is crucial. It's crucial because we need to have foundations for psychology. We need to know what those foundations are in terms of the concepts that psychologists employ. It's important to clarify those concepts. One of the ways you can do that is by understanding the metaphysical, ontological implications of those concepts. So that's really what I'm going to be doing in my talk. Apologies to people who are not philosophers here. So I may lose you along the way, and that's why I think it's important for you to put up your hand if there's anything I'm saying that's not clear. So affordances, what are they? Well, we all know the classical definitions given of them. They're possibilities for action that are available in the environment that can be used by any animals that can perceive and act on those possibilities. So that's the basic idea of affordance. So, when he said this, post-cognitive psychology is going to seek to explain cognition, cognitive behavior, cognitive systems in relation to the affordances of the environment provides. This is a workshop about social cognition. So, the key question that I want to organize my talk around is how to think about the place of social life within such a post-cognitive approach to psychology. So by social life, I'm going to mean the regular, stable patterns of behavior that form over time between people, that over time we'll see is going to be quite crucial as my talk goes on. So that's what I'm going to mean by sociality. It's the patterns of behavior that stabilize, that form between people, and not only people, because many other animals are also social animals. But when I use the term social, I mean these kinds of stable regularities in behavior that form amongst groups, amongst communities, perhaps, of interacting individuals. And so what I want to ask today is, how should we think about the place of social life within a post-cognitivist approach to psychology? So I've already said that post-cognitivist approach is going to think about behavior in relation to the affordances of the environment. So my question can be rephrased as, how should we think about the relationship between affordances and social life? And what I want to do is to take up a recent paper by Ed Bax, where he argues that all affordances are social. So he wants to argue that it doesn't really make sense to make a distinction between material affordances on the one hand, that maybe exist in a natural environment that is sort of there already before there's any kind of social life within that environment. And then introduce some other affordances which are to do with possibilities for social interaction. And call those social affordances. Bax has argued that we should think that all affordances are social. So this distinction between material or natural affordances, like the possibility to hide in a hole from a predator for a little mouse that's being chased by a cat. We shouldn't think that there's these sorts of natural material affordances that the environment offers, and then there's somehow overlaid on top of those affordances special class affordances that we're going to call social affordances. We should instead argue that all affordances are social. And that's the sort of argument that I want to explore with you today, but in a different direction from what you would find in the Bax paper, for any of you that have read that or go and read it later. I'm going to offer a different route to the same conclusion. So just think about this Euclidean axe that you can see here. That has material affordances. It can be used to cut things with, for instance. But it also has a history to it. It was part of the social life of people at a particular time in human history. So the argument that I want to make is that we can't take the material affordances of the axe in isolation from that socio-historical context in which it was first made. We need to think of the affordances of the axe in the context of the social life of people that were using it. Okay, so the human environment has been structured, shaped by generations. So all of the structure in the environment, all of the affordances that it offers, have taken form, have developed and grown in that environment over the course of human history. And we know very well now that the human influence on the environment, on the natural environment, on our ecologies, has not always been for the better. All kinds of ways in which the structures that the human environment offers to us are incredibly precarious now because of the ways in which our environment has been structured by our history of activity. So when we're thinking about the ecological context, it's important to think of it in this temporal, extended, historical, we'll take this historical view on it, that environment is formed over a long period of time. So Alan Koskell talks about affordances as belonging to what he calls a humanized nature. What he means by that is that nature has become social over the course of human evolution, over the course of evolutionary history. So what we now inhabit is an environment that is not only a natural environment, but it's also a social environment. That's the result of this long process of evolution. And Koskell argues, and I completely agree with him, that when we're doing psychology, we should avoid what he calls subjectivizing the social. So what would it be to subjectivize the social? Well, it would be to treat the social in the same way as psychologists for a long time treated subjective experience. as something that should be excluded and excised from any science. And I think there's a tendency actually within ecological psychology as well to subjectivize the social, to treat it as something that should be excluded from the kind of psychology that we're doing. I want to argue strongly that the nature, the natural environment that we inhabit is a humanized nature. And that will lead to a view of affordances, which I'm going to try to unpack as constitutively social. So what do I mean by the constitutive there? That's a difficult word for you to get your head around, but part of what I mean is that when we're doing this post-cognitive psychology, social life isn't only what we need to explain, it can also be what does the explaining. So when it comes to appealing to affordances, we can't use the notion of affordance to explain social life, because affordances themselves, I'm going to argue, are constitutively social. So to explain the social in terms of affordances would amount to giving a kind of circular explanation, where you're appealing to something that is already social to explain the social. So what I want to try to argue is that that for this claim here, that affordances are constitutively social, and I'll unpack what exactly that means. Well, I'm going to do that by opposing a view of the environment, which you find in recent work by Ed Banks and Tony Chiliro. So here I'm going to pick a bit of a fight with Tony, but I love Tony and I'm a huge fan of his work. So this is one of those instances where philosophers get into these disagreements that are really quite small against the backdrop of a huge amount of agreement. So don't mistake my criticisms here for serious disagreement with Tony and Ed. There's so much that I agree with in their work, but the point of bringing out this disagreement is to really try to bring out what are the foundational concepts that this post-cognitive psychology needs. And it's important to get clear on those disagreements in order to understand what the foundations are for psychology. So that's why I'm doing it. Ed and Tony write, the environment is the physical world. They don't just say that, they consider it from the vantage point of an animal, so there's a relation there. But the thing I want to pick up on is that it's the animal in relation to a physical world that we need to think of when we're trying to make sense of behavior in relation to the environment in the way that I've described at the beginning of my talk. They go on, when looked at from the point of view of a behaving animal, a portion of the physical world, that's the thing I want to really object to, is also a meaningful environment. So how is it then that from a point of view of a behaving animal, something that's physical becomes meaningful? And I want to argue that we can attack that question much more easily if we think it's not the physical world that is meaningful from the point of view of an animal, but rather this humanized nature, a social world, a world that's organized and structured by a history of social life. So from a vantage point of an animal on such an environment that's structured by social life, we can begin to see how that environment could be meaningful. But if we think of the environment as a physical world, then I think we face a problem. We face the problem of meaning. So it's from the shared social world that I'm suggesting that affordances get their meaning. If we have that shared social world in view, then we can understand how it could be that from the vantage point, from the point of view of a behaving animal, that world could be meaningful. But if we think of the environment as a physical world, then I think it becomes very mysterious how meaning could emerge out of that physical world. So many animals develop in a shared intersubjective environment. They learn from others what can be done in that environment. And that process of development, of learning, is what we should look to for understanding how that environment becomes meaningful, how it comes to offer affordances. So Ed and Tony make a distinction between three senses of environment in the papers that I'm discussing today. We already heard about these papers from Melina briefly and Atul. They distinguish the physical world, first of all, from the habitat. So the habitat is going to be the physical world, understood in relation to a typical member of a species. And then they make a further distinction between the habitat and the umwelt. The umwelt is the habitat as experienced by an individual, or in relation to a particular individual. Oh, I didn't finish that sentence, sorry. But what I should have said is a individual with a particular point of view on that environment. So that point of view can be the result of a long history of development that I've been talking about. So for Tony and Ed, it's the umwelt that's going to explain how the environment becomes meaningful for an individual. But the habitat itself already offers these affordances. It's the habitat that we might be interested in when we're doing experiments in psychology. Whereas if we're doing phenomenology, then we're going to be more concerned with the umwelt. If we want to bring the two together, then we're going to think about, well, how does the umwelt maybe emerge out of the habitat? So post-cognitivist psychology is going to be founded on two directions of research, as Ed and Tony describe it. Again, Melina talked about this yesterday. So ecological psychology starts from the world or the habitat, and then thinks of the world or the habitat as containing, maybe we should be careful about how we phrase this exactly, but containing information that's about affordances that can be used by a typical member of a species. A member of a species that can perceive and act on those affordances. Okay? Whereas the enactive approach, I haven't really talked about so far in my talk, starts from the other side of the perceiving animal, for whom there's information that's meaningful, that then allows that perceiving animal to bring forth a world or an umwelt, so that the physical world is then transformed into this meaningful environment for the animal. So we've got these two different directions of research. The umwelt is understood in relational terms, but the habitat is not. And that's the thing that I want to object to. I want to argue that both habitat and umwelt should be understood in relational terms, because both are constitutively social. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do in the rest of my talk. Let me pause there to just check that everyone is following me so far. So, do you know what I mean when I say this word constitutive? So talk in those terms is just to say what makes something the thing it is. So what makes an affordance an affordance? And I'm saying that it's social life that makes an affordance, whereas Michael Turvey would say it's the dispositions of the physical world of it. And I think that when Ed and Tony are describing the habitat, then they use this dispositional notion of affordance, because the environment is the physical world. Affordances become these physical properties of things that can be investigated in the lab when you put groups of subjects with particular activities in relation to those dispositions. Then you can begin to explain the behavior of those subjects under particular experimental conditions. Okay, so what I'm going to argue next is that the umwelt and the habitat should both be understood in relation terms. You should not think of the habitat as a physical world. You should instead think of the habitat in relation to forms of life. So that's the concept I want to introduce you to next. I'm going to do that through going back to the radical empiricism of William James. There.
I mean, just a clarification, maybe it sounds a little argumentative, but it's...
If it is, then I'm going to
No, I
put it
understand
into
that,
the
but
question mark.
is it the case that if you're saying, well, you know, universally this habitat is relational and social, then you're denying any sort of distinction between nature and natur and Geist. Yeah, and so
Yeah, denying any distinction between.
people don't hear me. I think I'm loud enough now.
It's just for the people online.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. So you would have to say then that, you know, that the affordances of tech, famously from Umbo, are social affordances that ticks respond to carbon dioxide and so on because of something social.
Okay, so this is an example of a question I would call an objection rather than a question of clarification.
I was trying to hide that part. It sounded like it.
Okay, so I'm defending that relational view as Tony does about affordances. I think Tony kind of backtracks on his relationism a bit too quickly in developing this notion of habitat. So I want to argue, going back to William James's radical empiricism, that we need a thoroughgoing relationalism, both about the Umwelt and habitat. So how should we think about relations? What are they? This is a bit of metaphysics I think we need from Dewey and Bentley. A relation is such that no one constituent of an inquiry, so the inquiry can be like a scientific inquiry, or it can be what you're doing when you run into problems in your everyday life, can be adequately specified as fact, apart from the specification of other constituents of the full subject matter. So that's quite a difficult sentence, isn't it? But what he means there is that we're thinking about the environment, we're thinking about the perceiving, acting animals that inhabit that environment like this collegially. And the idea of a relation is that you need both the animal and the environment. You need the relation of mutuality between them to understand either. So that's the idea of relationalism I'm going to be pursuing. And I want to argue that the way to think about this relationalism is through experience, actually. So relationalism is a phenomenological idea at the end of the day. This is quite complex, so we're probably going to need to talk about this a bit in the discussion as well. But what stands behind relationalism, as I understand it, is this idea of experience as being prior to any subject-object dichotomy. So we saw this quote yesterday from Tony when he introduced the idea of affordances as relations. The affordances cut across the dichotomy of subjective and objective. The thing I want to take up is actually this last part of the quote here, that affordances are both physical and psychical, yet neither. Tony also picks up on that, connected it to what we call neutral monism. So neutral monism is like a metaphysical position about the nature of matter that says that matter is neither physical nor mental. It's somehow both, but neither. That's confusing, I know. But I don't want to understand this as this idea of affordances as being neither psychical, mental, nor physical, as a metaphysical claim. I don't want to understand it as a claim about the matter that makes up the world, what reality is fundamentally made up of. Instead, I want to think of it as a phenomenological claim. Okay? So when we say affordances are both physical and psychical, I want to read that as a claim about what William James called the facts of experience. So what James is describing is the fundamental non-dual way that subjects relate to the world. He's describing how prior to our bringing in distinctions between subjects and objects, there's just this relation where to understand a relation, you need to understand all of the constituents that form that relation. So to think about this in terms of the facts of experience, what James is pointing to is what I'm going to talk about in terms of a dynamical flow of experience. James talked about a stream of experience that we shouldn't cut up into bits, but rather we should think of it as just a flowing dynamic stream. So experience has this dynamism to it. And it's concepts that we use when we attend to a particular object or particular property that lead us to make this division between subjects and objects. But before we bring in any concepts to bear on our experience, there is just this flow, this stream. there are felt relations. Those felt relations are then called invitations. So within the dynamics and flow of experience, we just find skillful subjects who are responsive to the changing demands of activity situation. This is what we call skilled intentionality. So we should see this idea of affordance, understood in relational terms, as part of an anti-intellectualist approach to how subjects relate to the world. Instead of thinking of subjects as relating to the world primarily through judgment, through knowledge, the idea here is that subjects relate to the world through this pure experience, which has this felt, dynamic, flowing quality to it. And affordances are introduced against the backdrop of that idea of experience as dynamic as this flowing stream. So what James was doing with his radical empiricism, which is the foundations for his post-cognitive psychology. Remember I said at the beginning that post-cognitivism requires us to go back to actually ideas that were emerging in psychology at the beginning of psychology. What James was doing was objecting to intellectualist ideas that came from Kant, where we think of subjects as relating to the world through judgments, where those judgments need some kind of contribution from perception. So you need both judgment and perception to get behind, but still with a relation of subjects to the world is understood fundamentally in terms of judgment. And James was offering an anti-intellectualist way of thinking about how subjects relate to the world, where that relation is prior to any division between subject and object. Instead, what we have is this unity of subject and object, which we can think of as experience in action, as this skillful responding to the demands of the situation. This should maybe ring some bells with you for those of you who know the work of Hubert Dreyfus, who talked about skillful coping or absorbed coping. That's a very similar idea to what James was describing in terms of pure experience. So everyday experience, pure experience, as James called it, rests on this bedrock of skill that allows us to deal more or less well and fluently with the demands of everyday life. We just find ourselves responding to situations. And we don't need to step back and make these sorts of judgments in relation to those situations. Rather, the way that cognition works ordinarily is in terms of this skillful responding to the demands of those situations. So now a question arises, what I'm going to call the problem of selection. There are many, many affordances that the environment offers. And those affordances, both for individuals and for the species, I'll qualify that reference to species a bit later on, should be understood in relational terms. In terms of pure experience, where there's no distinction between subject and object, yet rather a unity of subject and object. But many of the affordances that we come across, we feel no inclination to respond to. Others draw us towards them, while some other affordances push us away and empower us. But many affordances don't move on at all, we just move past them. So right now, if I were to offer you a glass of wine and a cigarette, some of you would maybe take up my invitation, but many of you would say, no, this is not the right setting to enjoy a glass of wine together. And the cigarettes can wait till later. So we need to make a distinction then between affordances that move us to act on them and affordances that leave us cold, that are not relevant to us in any particular way in our situation. What is it that accounts for the selection from all of the affordances the environment offers? Just the relevant affordances. We can think of this as similar to a problem that arises in artificial intelligence. I'm not going to go into this deeply, we can talk about it more in the discussion if you like. This is a problem of relevance. So in artificial intelligence, you can give like in good old fashioned AI, also machine learning, you can have a system that has a lot of information available to it. That might be the result of learning, or it might be pre-programmed. And the problem with that system is then to work out in a particular situation, from everything it knows, what is relevant to that particular situation. So if something changes, what did it do with that change in information? How did it update its knowledge? And the problem is that everything can be potentially relevant. How do you determine what's actually relevant in a given situation? And similarly, when we're acting in a situation, all affordances could be potentially relevant as well. So how do we select from all of the possible affordances in that situation, just those that are relevant to our interests in that particular situation? And here I think it's important to make a distinction between invitations and affordances. So this cat here is a very curious cat generally are, and it's invited to look inside of the cardboard box. So that cardboard box has a kind of demand character to it. It demands being explored and investigated by the cat. So how do we make this distinction then between invitations and affordances? What are invitations? Well, here's Dreyfus and Kelly describing them. They say that the world solicits a certain activities, to say that the agent feels immediately drawn to act in a certain way. So you can see some of the things showing up here already that Dreyfus and Kelly are getting from the phenomenological tradition of Merleau-Ponty, Heidegger, that also connects well with what I was describing in William James, this notion of pure experience. So there's a felt relation here, see, that the agent feels immediately drawn. And there's also a flow of activity. So the agent is doing something in the world, and the world invites them to act in a particular way. And notice this is experiential, it's the environment calling for a certain way of acting from the agent. But we know not all performances are inviting, like I said, the glass of wine is not inviting to you right now. Dancing on the table is not inviting to you right now. Pulling your neighbour's hair, sorry, is not inviting to you right now. You could do it, you're not going to. So there are many things that you could do that are inviting. So what accounts for invitations, inviting performances emerging out of the landscape? If we can explain that question of how invitations emerge out of a landscape of possible affordances, that will give us a way of answering the problem of selection, I would say. It will also give us crucial ingredients for answering the relevance problem of artificial intelligence. So what we've done to try to do some conceptual groundwork here is make a distinction between landscapes of affordances, which are the totality of affordances that the environment offers, and fields of relevant affordances. What I want to do in this last part of my talk is argue that both the landscape and the fields are organized by social life over time, over history, over a long period of history. So we should think of both the fields in the context of the developmental history of an individual learning skills within their communities or within a social context. And we should think of the landscape of affordances also as socially structured and socially organized. So the field of relevant affordances is defined in relation to an individual as the involved. So involved and field are roughly coextensive in terms of what they are trying to pick out conceptually. And the landscape is not like the habitats. It's defined not in relation to a typical member of a species, but in relation to what Eric and I call forms of life, borrowing from Wittgenstein. So here I should note that we're not following St. Jean, as we called it yesterday. This is our own innovation, if you like, with the concept of affordance that he introduced. We are now trying to build bridges between St. Jean and I'm not going to moving Wittgenstein's or a special title, but he occupies a similar place in our philosophy as James Gibson does in the ecological psychologist's philosophy. So what we're trying to do is build a bridge between Wittgenstein and James Gibson and William James Gibson was drawing on. And think about the landscape of affordances in relation to this notion of forms of life. A form of life is social life. It's regular, stable patterns of interaction that form between interacting individuals within groups, within communities, within societies, within nations. These are all examples of forms of life. And the form of life is an anthropological concept. It's a concept of stable and regular patterns of activity that could be observed were you to go and immerse yourself in the social life of the group. You would be able to observe these stable, regular patterns of behavior. So we're arguing for a view of the shared environment of performances that Tony and Ed call a habitat as a landscape of performances that should be understood in relation to forms of life. And the difference between Eric and I, and Tony and Ed, is that we think that that shared environment shouldn't be understood in relation to a typical member of a species, but instead in relation to this anthropological notion of form of life. And the reason that's important is because agents, and here I'm going to talk about agency briefly, are not only finding structure in the environment, they're also making that structure through the activities that they engage in, many of which are structured by forms of life, by practices. So we bring in this notion of socio-materiality to try to capture this point that Ed Baggs makes that people all affordances is social. There's no difference between materiality and sociality, but the two are entangled. So we should think of the material structure in the environment as a structure that's made through human activity. It's socio-material structure. Practices, social practices, forms of life, are structuring activities that can be thought of using a notion that John Trotter called formative causation, drawing on the House of Sealing tradition. So agents are not just finders of this material structure, that's lawfully specified by information that's contained in the ambient array in the way that light interacts with surfaces. Rather, agents are makers of structure through the activities that they engage in, which are socially organized activities that are organized by agents belonging to forms of life. I'm bringing my talk to a close now. This idea of making is crucial, that affordances are in some sense made. They're made by people engaging in social practices. So think of the path as a very simple example of a structure in the environment made by people who repeatedly traverse that area of woodland, and as over time they walk along that area of woodland, a path forms. So looking backwards over time, we can observe a structure, an affordance to take this path, for instance, through the woods, forest. So you have something that is specified and determined through the past action of individuals. But looking forwards, what we have is a structure that perhaps anticipates a particular way of particular regularity in behavior, but still there's some kind of indeterminacy and open-endedness. So what anticipates is a process that's productive or formative of a particular structure. I want to unpack exactly what I mean by this notion. Production, formation. The future actions that those structures in the environment offer have a kind of indeterminacy and uncertainty about them. So whether this path continues to fall in walking on very much depends on whether it continues to be used by future generations. If it doesn't, then it's just going to get overgrown and it won't be a path any longer. So there's some uncertainty and indeterminacy about the structures that form in the environment and the affordances those structures offer. So notice that I'm offering a view of affordances as processes, first of all, where processes are extended through time. and you can look backwards on the process to find a product, a structure that's formed somehow. That's how lots of people think about affordances. They're just available to us. That's how I talked about it at the beginning. They're what the environment provides. Sure, if we look backwards, the environment provides those affordances, but looking forwards in time, looking in a future-oriented or an anticipatory way, what the environment offers is uncertain and indeterminate. Whether the environment continues to offer those affordances depends on our human activities. Depends on whether we continue to use that forest path, as to whether that forest path continues to afford being walked on. So think of affordances then as like formative borders, where we can unpack what a formative pause is by thinking about a seed and a plant. So it's not the case that the seed already contains everything that's needed for the plant to grow. Rather, the plant is not somehow pre-formed and fully specified within the seed. In a similar way, affordances are not like seeds that the environment provides us with, that already are pre-given, fully formed possibilities for action. There's some kind of indeterminacy, uncertainty, open-endedness about the structures that the environment offers that we can take up and act on. The plant is a result of growth, an ordered transition from an indeterminate to a determinate form. Here I'm just drawing on Schottler again, through the interaction of the seed with its surroundings. Similarly, affordances have the same indeterminacy. They also grow over time through the activities of individuals engaging in the practices of their communities. So when I say that affordances are socially constituted, I mean they are diachronically constituted. They're constituted over time. They don't exist ready-made, already given to us in the environment. Instead, we need to think of past activities as setting up particular conditions for us that we can then continue in the future through our activities of engaging in particular social practices, just like the forest path, for example. So affordances are not like something that's already there, nor do they belong to a kind of platonic realm of forms, so that we can think there's like the form of sittability of the chair, where the chair for sitting on. Sittability is like this form that exists already in this platonic realm. Affordances are not like that, I'm arguing, ontologically. They're rather dynamic stabilities that form over time, that are produced through human activity of engaging in social practices. They are produced and reproduced within flows of activity. Remember that notion of flow of activity goes back to James's notion. Your experience connects to what Drive towards skillful coding. So affordances are set up through a past history of practice that then gets continued and maintained through the activities of individuals engaging in those practices. Whether the environment continues to offer those affordances to us depends on whether those affordances are maintained or do they die off. So affordances have a precarious life. Affordances are in a process of becoming. They don't fully exist prior to action, but they develop in social activities that are incomplete, that we have to continue through our future activities. So, some clarifications. This is not social constructivism I'm offering. I'm not saying that affordances are constructed for us through our social life, because crucially, affordances have both the sociality and the materiality to them. They are entanglement and intertwinement of sociality and materiality. So the socio-material practices of what I'm calling this form-producing process. They are what the affordances grow out of. And affordances we can look back on and see as products of this process. But crucially, those products are never fully formed. There's always some indeterminacy and open-endedness that has to then be taken up in future activity. So how are fields and landscapes related? Well, not in the way that an umbrella and a habitat are related. They stand in a relation of reciprocity. I don't think that's true of the way that the habitat and the umbrellas are described in Tony's work. So this is something we've argued for in a paper in Days and a special issue on Gestalt psychology, that the field and landscape should be thought of as in a reciprocal relation. So not only the case that when we act on the landscape, we change something in the landscape, we also in some sense contribute to the continuation of those affordances in the landscape. So think about soil and whether it affords growing food. Well, that really depends on our farming practices. Our farming practices can destroy the capacity of soil to support the growing of food. So whether soil continues to offer us that possibility or engaging in agricultural practices very much depends on how we engage in those agricultural practices and whether we maintain those affordances. The affordances that the soil offers up are incredibly precarious. It's up to us to how we organise our activities as to whether the lived environment for us, ecology that we inhabit, continues to offer us that capacity to grow food. So I started off with the question, what's the place of social life in post-cognitivist psychology, in ecological and active psychology? And I've argued that social life can be thought of as an externals, because affordances are constitutively social, they grow out of social practice. I've talked about affordances as diachronically constituted. So I've described affordances as processes that form over time and that need to be maintained through our activity. So affordances can be thought of as these dynamic stabilities. But any dynamic stability can easily fall apart, can easily no longer maintain its form. So whether or not that stability continues to offer the possibilities is very much up to how humans act in constructing those possibilities. Affordances are produced, reproduced within flows of activity that are structured by these socio-material practices. Okay, thanks for your attention. Questions?
Just before the questions, just a quick announcement. There's going to be an alarm sound at 11, and we don't have to evacuate or anything. It's just for the coordinación de humanidades.
Yeah, I have, I really like very much all this approach, and I think so that certainly I basically understand basically all what you said, but I have some questions that are not from now, perhaps later. One is, I don't very much see what you call the problem of selection, because I do not think that somehow affordances are something that you select in a way that assume like you have whether you want an apple or an orange, and somehow there is something that doesn't seem to relate with the basic idea of affordance of having a diachronic constitution. And I think that if you think of affordances as having a diachronic constitution, then in a way, maybe it would be better to say something that you participate in affordances, something like that, something that doesn't lead to the problem of selection. And well, that's one thing, and just another thing that I would want to ask. Maybe it's not related, but is why let's see. The notion of the idea of diachronic constitution of affordances, and I guess you agree that basically we could talk of practices and some practices constitute are the diachronic constitution of affordances.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. But then there will be the question of how these practices relate to each other, and how these practices sort of get into a hierarchy or some sort of connection. So for you to decide what to do or how to get involved with certain affordance. I don't know if you understand what I am.
I do, yeah. I think that's a very complex question. What I want to say is that,
Okay, we're
that Wittgenstein would describe it as a hurly-burly. So what he means by that is just that all the practices form a kind of holistic structure. They're interrelated. You can't like single out a particular practice and say that practice functions in isolation from all of the other practices.
and you see how that
To make that less abstract, think about teaching as a practice and how that practice of teaching involves many other practices like parenting, librarians, and setting up the classes. And so within a particular form of life, there's going to be relations to other forms of life. That means that you're always working within a whole web, a meshwork of different practices that kind of entangle with each other.
you see how that relates, or how I see that it's related with the problem of selection.
Yes, so it is definitely related to the problem of selection. So what makes the relevance problem so difficult for artificial intelligence is exactly this way that the structure of our everyday life has this meshwork character to it, where you can't like single out what someone knows within a particular domain and take that to be like isolatable from other domains. And as soon as you start to try to unpack what people are doing in a particular situation, that inevitably requires you to make reference to all the other situations they act in. So pretty quickly you get this complexity that even if you've got a machine that's learning like our deep learning networks now, it's still going to struggle to learn the very complex environment in which there's this entanglement of different practices. And that's why you see these kind of adversarial problems in deep learning networks. And probably you don't know what I'm talking about now, but they recognize and classify things, but they make very silly mistakes because in the end they don't really know their way around the humans inhabit. So the things that they're classifying and recognizing don't have meaning for them in the way that they do for humans, because we are able to navigate our way around this these different forms of life and the relations between them.
Thanks a lot, Julian. It was a great talk. I definitely agree with everything that you said, like all the concept, everything. Only I think that you got me very excited, and you know why. You started talking about the relevance problem, which of course is something very interesting in my field. But I felt that I mean I'm sure it's not really the aim of this talk, but I would like more a bit more of your opinion on that, on how we solve it. That's our problem. How can we go? I mean, for us, after so many years in what we are doing, it came sort of clear that there is a very important part on what's intrinsic motivation, the satisfaction of physiological needs, for this problem of action selection and relevance, minimization of prediction error and so on. What's your take on all that? I mean, I know it's not particularly
what brought me into this whole field was Dreyfus's idea of a cognitive science or an artificial intelligence that was inspired by phenomenology, by this idea of skillful coping. What people should be attempting to do who want to reverse engineer the mind is attempt to build machines that can skillfully cope with their environments. So that means they're able to do what we do when we have peer experience, skillfully responding to the demands of a situation. And what that takes is developing skills, so you need a developmental approach to philosophy science, where you've got systems that can kind of build on their capabilities and grow those capabilities. You also need these skills, ability, complexly nested interactive. So the idea that we've got is like domain-specific modules, and we can kind of stack them up like what looks right. And in the end, you'll have a kind of body culture. I think it's not the right way to go, because it's not in the end going to get you a system that has the skills for navigating the very complex structured environments that we inhabit. So what you need is a system that can kind of feel its way through that environment towards the possibilities that are relevant and inviting for an agent that's going to meet the demands of that particular situation. So that means that the system has to have something that's doing the work of evaluation and affect, much like sort of systems that you're interested in building that have this intrinsic motivation to them. So those are some of the ingredients I think that are necessary. The way that we think about the relevance problem in our work is through this notion of the problem of selection that Sergio mentioned. Why is it that from all of the possibilities that are there in the environment, in a particular situation, some invite you to do what's appropriate to that situation, what a skillful agent would do in that situation. That's the key question I think you need to answer in building these sorts of systems if you're going to solve that very tricky problem. But I can only like map out conceptually what a solution would look like. I have no idea how you would go about building systems that can avoid that problem. I think it's just a really central problem in artificial intelligence and cognitive science. And it calls for a post-cognitivist answer.
So there are 3 more questions. So Francisco, Lenny, and Susana, we have no more time, but we can call you also. So can you?
It's been a thank you very much. Given the convergences that exist between what you have presented today and what made currently by people working in what I would describe as relational processual philosophy of biology, I would like to ask you about how do you see time in relation to the whole account? So people in the field may have this mention, make the distinction between ontogenetic time, when we are talking about animals, and ecological and phylogenetic. So yeah, in the case of the cat that you were showing, that cat is part of the social life household. You put the cat on the basement, that basement, that cat will continue to experience some process that belong to the ontology of that. Maybe that cat will die in a few days.
So I like the distinctions that you made between the ontogenetic, the ecological, and the phylogenetic. But I think maybe we need also a phenomenological account of temporality as well.
Exactly. This is my point. How do you find the need to make further distinctions of types of classes of time?
Yes.
In order to really connect.
So we talked a little bit about agency yesterday, and I think it's crucial to have a notion of temporality that helps us to understand agency. So this John Foster paper that I use a lot talks about a dual structure. There's a structuring and the structure that forms through that structuring activity. So you need this duality of structure and long-term agent. So the structure of what you see when you look backwards, the structuring is what you see when you look forward. That's the productive, the making aspect of the agency of the activity. An agency, I think, is what we need to understand about organisms. So when we're thinking of organisms as processes, we need that notion of agency to understand what organisms are. And the other notions of temporality that we're bringing on are important for understanding how the agent develops, how it's involved, what kind of ecological niche does it inhabit. And so all those notions of temporality are needed. But to understand the agent and to understand the groups of that agent as a whole, you need this dual structuring idea of agency.
We have 5 minutes, so please be short.
My answer. We can always continue discussions over the rest of the course of the workshop, lunchtime, and other times we get together. So don't have to do anything now.
I mean, as a former student of Dreyfus myself and other people, sympathetic to much of your intentions, but it seems to me there's a way of deepening the project, perhaps radicalizing it, that involves a third direction of post-cognitive research. And I would also go back to something earlier in the 18th century when Enlightenment thinkers like Hume, but especially like Herder, decided that it's time to look back upon the human organism and no longer be beholden to a theological anthropology, but to use the sciences of the earlier centuries to inform ourselves with an emancipatory interest. The first thing they noticed is that we're oddly deficient as physiological creatures. We're under-specialized. We're born radically vulnerable, so-called secondary altricial birth. And this became really the point of departure for what in the German tradition is philosophical anthropology, an attempt to integrate the resources of German idealism and phenomenology with contemporary science. Now, this idea of radical deficiency, which the Germans, with their usual subtlety, call Mangelwesen, it's a very soft term of deficiency. I mean, it suggested rather than the kind of continuity of nature, which I think we are still, it suggests we're still beholden to what I would call 19th century English naturalism, has to be rethought. It was a kind of a radical break, which leads to a new understanding of hominin anthropogenesis, of hominin to human evolution, based upon this radical deficiency, which involves a kind of radical need and a need for a very totalizing kind of compensation. Well, what is that compensation? Okay, I'll wrap it up. Yeah, the compensation has to do with normativity, with the a radical transition to a first time fully normatively integrated form of life, which you have with, I think, Homo erectus already. So the suggestion then is that the third direction is one that understands the need to understand hominins and human anthropogenesis in a distinctive way, and that gives normativity a distinctive significance that allows for an understanding of the heightened contingency of hominin and human life forms, right? As opposed to kind of a continuity assumption that builds in incremental ways on the animal phenotype and so on. And just the last point, I think that only by way of doing this do we have the resources to bring normativity into the equation in a serious way. And I have to say that normativity is absent from your account as it was from Dreyfus. I mean, it's something I argued with Dreyfus about. That's a whole conversation we could have. I think without needs, there's no normativity. You can't understand normativity.
I'm sure there's many rich resources to be drawn on in philosophical anthropology, thinking about how nature and culture come together in human existence. And yeah, so that's something that connects very nicely with my thought, complements it. But the aim today was just to try to show, to make an argument for why all forms should be moral and social. Normativity, I think, comes through the form of life. So Wittgenstein was very much concerned with understanding normativity and traced it back to well, there's many different readings of them, but I favour a communal reading of him, that normativity comes from the communities that we grow up in, that we develop in. So normativity is central to how I think about forms, because I define them in relation to forms of life. We continue.
Be quiet.
Thank you for your question. Just a simple and very question. You say that it's social life that makes an information. Is this the case for all the forms of life, including non-social animals, or like that implies there will be a landscape of philosophers for non-social animals, or would you rather say that there are not really non-social animals? That all animals are social.
Good question. I think it also sort of relates to what Lenny was pointing to, that there may be discontinuity that we need to think about when we look at evolutionary history between human forms of life and the forms of life of other animals. But I think group life is not something that's uniquely human. So there are new social insects that have to see kind of symbiotic relationship between very simple life. Not simple in the sense of it's not complex, it's incredibly complex as well. So social relations, I feel like animal behavior, involve groups. I don't think it's something that's uniquely human. We trace their continuity through all organismic behavior. So the question is then, well, there's different notions of sociality that we need to bring in. That's clearly right. There's some distinguishing features of social life in humans and the kind of normativity that comes with that, like Laura has explored, for instance, in thinking about normativity from an active perspective. There are important distinctions we need to make. I don't want to paint a picture where the sociality is the same in all forms of life. It's not. There's lots of politics and differences that we need to understand and make sense of. So I think the way around this problem is not to think, once we think of forms as temporary, temporal process and cognition through time. And we have all the notions of temporality that transcendental mentioned on genetic, or phylogenetic. And all of those, I think, are going to involve not just individual organisms, but also interacting with the organisms and kind of symbiotic relationships that form. So within the landscape, I think there's no reason to think that there are any creatures that would not fit creatures in a social life.
Well, thank you very much, Julian.
Hello. I wanted to ask you, do you have any reference or name of that phenomenological AI model you mentioned or something like that? Or
Yes,
how can
yeah.
I talk
Yeah.
about that?
So there's a paper that Hubert Dreyfus wrote called "What is Heideggerian Cognitive Science?"
What is Heideggerian what?
Cognitive science.
Cognitive science.
Yeah. It's 2007. There's like a really long version that you can find, and then there's shortened version. And the shortened version is in journal Artificial Intelligence. And then I published an edited anthology called Heidegger and Cognitive Science or something like that. There's a version of it published in there as well. If you email me, I can send it to you.
Okay. What contact email? I'm sorry, my keyboard is.
Just look me up and you'll find me.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Very
Thanks.
interesting.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I'm just missing, like, of course, what nobody knows, no, and that's what actually is.
It's your projects, you know, it's your work. I see. I see.
I will leave soon, so do you want to
Fine.
go closer?
I'll take your seat when you go. It's okay.
Okay.
Like, mine, and having a possibility of consciousness. And in my second part, I will talk about maybe ways of experiencing with others, or maybe through others. And well, this has a catch because I am going to think that maybe are two. No. And finally, as a final remark, I will present some concepts about what's going to be about incorporation and responsibility. So, first of all, well, you know, I hope you know this famous paper. That they do not need to talk about extension. They talk about the use of how we use objects to extend in order to extend our cognitive processing. And they say that there is no need to talk in this more functionalist point of view. There is not a need to talk about the phenomenology of that extended mind, because these processes occurs mainly in as subpersonal processes. But then, at least in 2 different papers, we found that it's possible to talk about the phenomenology of extended mind, at least Chemeron Coffer says. And actually, this is from a non-functionalist point of view. But in a functionalist point of view, the Prester says that actually there is a need for a phenomenology of the extended mind, because how do we experience these the artifacts as a part of the body or just as scaffolds is important for to feel this the information that is contained or that is passing through these objects as part of our own cognitive processing. So we need to discuss this phenomenology, and she puts all the discussion in if we can have a sense of ownership of these objects, these extended objects. If we have a sense of ownership, definitely they are a part of our body, felt body, and of course our own cognitive processing, but only if these objects has this sense of ownership. So, well, it's interesting. I think I found this interesting because, first of all, the Prester puts the problem of incorporation and object to incorporate objects to our body motoric and perceptual experience, and the same level of discussion that our cognitive processing. So it seems that at least, and she also discusses with Merleau-Ponty's idea of incorporation, and it seems the idea of incorporation in a phenomenological point of view can be used and criticized in order to understand the cognitive processing. So I think what is very interesting, and also because she puts this idea of the self-awareness as a matter of sense of ownership rather than, for instance, sense of agency. Maybe the organism navigating the world is more important for this feeling of this object as a part of the world than just a sense of ownership as a representational matter. So, well, it's okay. But
I need to finish this part. The presenter distinguishes between extension and incorporation and says that in some situations, extended devices can be transparent, but transparency is not a good indicator of incorporation. This will be important. Later. So, well, let's wait. And I think, well, what's the problem with critiques to Merleau-Ponty's ideas on incorporation and this way to understand incorporation in terms of extended mind is that well, I think in general, we are forgetting what incorporation in phenomenological terms is about. And it's not about the body, it's about the world. And this is all the point. Or how and the body appears as the place, it was a place in quotation marks, in which the world appears from a first person perspective. So that's the point. So in this case, and if we feel, we understand that self-awareness is more like a bodily trait of the experience, and I am thinking in some paper about Mark Borner, that I was thinking about it when Jimena talks about interoceptivity. So I was thinking about this, about how we can understand self-awareness as a part of the constituting world rather than focusing on the subjects and how the subject is experienced this have self-awareness. So in this case, we can see how, for instance, I put this picture about Dan Mencina, this famous blind skater who uses his cane for having some pseudo-visual experiences, and how that is I'm interested about him because we can say that there is a world given in a first-person perspective that in some sense is canized. Is this way in which the world appears with this trait, this bodily trait that includes this cane as a part of him, as a part of it. And I have a quote from Mark Borner that I think is very related with Jimena's presentation, that says pre-reflective self-consciousness can be understood as a bodily trait which arises from the synergy of different neural and hormonal processes like sensation, memory, attention, and arousal that occur in a sufficient complex system of organism and environment. So I think he's missing sometimes objects can be a part of this synergy. We should include objects in this bodily trait. And in this case, well, transparency would be, at least in a Merleau-Pontian way, we should see transparency in terms of this body's activity in which the incorporated object through habit, and we know what habit means, becomes a part of this process of the constitutive process of having a world. And of course, this has some relation with this idea of a minimal self and the idea of a minimal self in terms of first personal givenness. I highlight that because according to me, I'm reading Zahavi and Kriegel. Well, I think they are focusing on the experience. In these cases, when they talk about first personal givenness or for meanness, they are putting the problem of the minimal self in the world rather than in the subject. So, well, okay, I think I say this. I think actually when we look, we all of us have, or majority of us have talked about Humboldt and Jacob von Uexküll as the father of the biosemiotic, at least. Well, people say that. And I think that And of course, in phenomenology is very important. Husserl talks about Umwelt and Umwelten in terms of von School, Merleau-Ponty, and so on. And I think, in some moments they are missing is missing the whole point of what, to me, von School or the work of von School is about, and the concept of Umwelt is about. And I think that the point here is the world, and this is that's why, at least in this book, I think it's a book, A Stroll Through the Worlds of Animals and Men, he draws on, he makes some representations of worlds, of how he understands the world, and all the point is the Umwelt are worlds. And what matters when we discuss the anatomy, or the biologist tries to understand the anatomy, is because he wants to understand this, the Umwelt, and for those bodies, okay? Not the bodies and the functioning of that bodies for themselves. Well, like 2 years ago, I was trying to explain all of this to a photographer. It's very hard to do that, but well, he may give me some pictures about what he understands about what, and I think that very interesting, because I think, well, in some way he captures the whole point of what I'm saying, that the body and the extended body is like is transparent, seems like a phantom. And I think I like the concept of phantom, but okay, it's like a phantom what matters here and what is happening through activity is the world. The world is at least experienced like something fixed, while the body is moving, and in that moving is not the thing, or what happens to the consciousness, or what is the consciousness about is the world rather than the body. And this happens, well, in different situations in which we are interacting with others. Actually, in this case, is definitely a proof, or at least we try to he tries to represent how in this case the object is part of the body, is what is moving in that situation, is part of what is moving in that situation, and therefore it's not a part of the world, it's not a part of the Umwelt, but through which the Umwelt is given to us. And of course others, in my case, well, maybe I have better pictures, but I think in some point others are part of this extended body, and in this coordination and our coordinated movement, it happens that we are a whole that's moving, and to which the world, to whom the world is given to. So okay. And so in this first part, the point is, and of course I want to present some idea of how we incorporate others. And first of all, how others can be incorporated has to do with how others can be involved in that first personal givenness, and if it is possible to think about the world as otherized. Remember the idea of canized. And I want to underline, my interest is the first personal givenness, okay? From a first person perspective. Well, definitely we need to discuss, but it's not the point in this presentation, what are the specific coupling strategies that we use to extend ourselves in others that definitely are different from those that correspond to coupling with objects. So I'm gonna read 3 different examples in my second part, and the second part of this presentation, and I will introduce, I think successfully, 3 or maybe 2 ways of experiencing through others. Well, So first of all, I'm gonna read this because it's easier to me. After a few seconds of silence in the middle of a phone conversation at a bar, my friend says, "Don't turn your head. Did you see the guy sitting on the right, the one who looks like Ryan Reynolds?" In my desire to continue our conversation, but barely remembering that I saw someone sitting at the table that she's pointing to, I say, "Yeah, I did." To which my friend replies, "Well, he's been looking at you the whole night." Suddenly, a fun girls' night conversation and for girls' night is full of tension. I see myself being aware of my gestures and of the intensity of my laughter. From time to time, my friend directs her gaze toward the table in question, and her mischievous smile makes me blush. At one point, I decide to turn my head, and I see that there is no one at the table. I get mad at my friend for not telling me that our Ryan has gone, and then I laugh at some nonsense she tells me. Well, a young man is receiving his college diploma. In the distance, he sees his parents cheering him, which makes him feel immense joy. Upon receiving the graduation diploma, he applauds his parents, to which they follow with an applause. His parents' applause increases his joy. And the third one, a 5-year-old girl is solving a puzzle with her mother. In the interaction, the mother points to a piece with her finger and remarks on its features while looking at the girl. "Do you see that this one has a little belly? Let's look for the one having a hole where this belly fits. But we also need to find that the color matches, right?" The girl carefully observes the features in the piece the mother presents and takes one piece at the table while pointing out the hole and asking, "This one?" No, well, okay. Well, so I said that I will present 3 ways of experiencing with others, but maybe 2. And I said that the first one is about maybe a second personal givenness, and well, I will say why I think that. And the second one is more like close to what Zahavi has called first personal plural experience, but I call givenness. And the third one is what I call extended first personal givenness. But I think that maybe B and C are the same. It's just I am using the concept of first personal plural givenness for my purpose. So, well, let's talk about this first personal plural givenness. This concept appears recently in Leon Santan Zahavi and Zahavi, and they are talking about affections and sharing affections and the experience of sharing affections. So they say that our and underline and I underline affective experiences are directly related to what we experience in other bodies. Remember the situation of the boy having this his graduation day, and there is a feeling of sharing the affective experience. And this author said that they consider an awareness of a minimal self and a minimal other should be necessary in order to have this affective coordination. They actually criticize some theories that think that maybe we can share the same kind of affective experience, like which would have maybe ontological implication, like there is a feeling, an emotion, like something we call emotion that is shared by 2 or more persons. But in this case, they say no, because sharing doesn't mean that we have the same token experience, but the same type. Sorry, the same type, and the same type has to do with this difference. we are aware of this difference between what is happening in the other and in myself because of this awareness, minimal awareness of self and others. And the extended first personal givenness has to do with, well, in my case, I understand in a more general perspective that coupling with the other bodies affect the way we perceptually experience objects from a first personal perspective. I think we can say that in the case of it's easier for us to understand that the mother, in the case of the solving a puzzle, is a part of this experience, the experience of the girl. I think it's easier when we talk about the perspective intentionality rather than affective intentionality. And I am not sure because of that, but I think in this case, at least in these authors, is important that to understand that affectivity is not this sharing affections is not like sharing the same token emotion or something like that. Well, but I think that definitely in coordination, other can become transparent and therefore incorporated. Because I think transparency, really transparency questions, they need to self-other differentiation, in this case of having some affection, shared affection. And I think there is a problem when we talk in these terms of minimal and other self, and we need to distinguish between them, because we are maybe not we are confused because we forget that shared affective intentionalities is different to talk about shared affections. And maybe the problem is that when we talk about the aboveness of consciousness and the intentionality, in terms of consciousness, we are talking about actually that world that is appearing in this affective or perceptual way. The point is that affections are not the thing we are experiencing. Affections are the vehicle through which we are experiencing a world. So in that case, others are a part of the way we are experiencing a world, in the way they are affecting our intentionality. I hope I can, and it's the basics of phenomenology. I think we are well, to me, as we talk about perception as an intentionality, a vehicle for having a world, well, affections are as well. And I think the whole point of Joanna Colombetti, actually. And well, this is the case. That's why I think that this distinction as plural givenness or plural experiences that came from these authors, Sahavian et al., and the difference between extended with first personal givenness is not necessarily because we can say that we are experiencing in a first personal perspective the world, but through extended with through others. So, but the first one, the experience with my friend at the bar and all this point of Ryan Reynolds, our phantom, I think it's kind of different, and I put this example here because I think express a different experience, in the phenomenal field. I called it second personal givenness because it refers to a type of coordination in which the other is not completely transparent. My friend is not completely transparent to me, as in the example of the mother or the parents at the graduation day. The other, her gestures and her verbal and corporal expressiveness in interaction with mine are the place from where my experience is projected. because I cannot see this person, Ryan Reynolds. It's a phantom. I would say it's a phantom in terms of phenomenology, in which we would say that it's not a product of imagination, it's not a fantasy, this Ryan Reynolds, because it's not in my head. Actually, I am feeling it. Him. I am blushing because I know, according to my friend, he's looking at me, and maybe I can experience some mental states of him just because my friend is smiling and doing some gesture that gives me that afford, if we can say that, afford this person or something like that. So his presence is a presence. The man as a phantom, and we have a beautiful video essay with Ariela Batana and Veronica Cohen about the phantom other. It's more related with virtuality, but I think it's similar to what I'm saying here. It's experience with the character of for otherness. It's not for meanness in the sense that it's not completely a first personal givenness, but it's a second personal givenness. It's that is include some way also incorporate, but it's not incorporated in the same way that I incorporate others, because what is incorporated here is this man as part of my phenomenal field. So, finally, I think, well, I have just 5 final remarks. The emphasis that I'm going to read, what all this tells us about incorporation and intersubjectivity. I think the emphasis on the givenness of experiences leads the research on intersubjectivity and maybe social cognition on how the live world is intersubjectively constituted. I think, I don't know where sometimes why if phenomenologists talk all the time about the world and intentionality and the aboutness of the consciousness, we are so focused in the subject and the self-experience and the body, the self-awareness as something that occurs from this side and not from that side, from the side of the world that is giving us this trait that I am involved in its constitution. Okay, but because the world, of course, is given to a consciousness. So the idea that others participate in our constitution of the live world does not exclude our body being the 0 point of experience of all of the idea of the body as a 0 point in Merleau-Pontian and Husserlian ways. Because I am talking about first personal givenness in the first place, well, maybe second in the case of the phantom, but I am not denying this idea of the self-awareness involved in that constitution. But it could give us arguments for understanding the way said body couples with external entity. As with objects, others' transparency results from a habit in which external expressions and gestures historically extend our meaningful projections to the world. I think, well, we have heard different presentations about the importance of taking into account history, the history of these couplings. This not occurs from the nowhere, no time. It's not instant. Actually, intersubjectivity and incorporating others is not instant. It's a part of a historical experience of our coupling with others. Sometimes there is incorporation without full transparency of others. This is my point with the second person givenness. The idea of extended intentionality does not exclude the possibility of our having experiences in which the others appears as others. Of course, I am not saying that we don't have experiences of others as others. I am just pointing out some possibility about how others are incorporated and are transparent in some ways in our experience of this world. But of course, it doesn't mean that we have this kind of combinations in which others appear as others. And well, finally, and this is my final slide, what makes, well, I took this quote from Clark, and when the time he replied to Adams and Aizawa about extended mind, well, we know that was very criticized, that hypothesis, and he says that what makes a process cognitive, it seems to me, is that it supports intelligent behavior. The alternative to paraphrase Dennett is that cognition is as cognition does. Actually, I like Dennett's part. I prefer that, because to me, I think in a phenomenology of incorporation, consciousness is what consciousness does, our world. What consciousness does, our world. And what matters to phenomenology, what should important in phenomenology is a world. When objects and others are a part of intentional acts in which the world is given, they are incorporated. So that's it. Thank you very much. Y aquí, the different image about my.
I just want to suggest that the philosophical anthropologist Helmut Plesner might be an interesting and useful interlocutor for you. And so Plesner is somebody who was both biologist, who studied with Hans Driesch, and philosopher, having studied with Husserl and other people. And on the basis of what he claims is not phenomenology, I mean, he was also influenced by the phenomenologist Max Scheler, and he was claiming he wasn't doing phenomenology, and I agree. I mean, I think there's sort of a Hegelian flavor to it, but you know, he tried to develop on the basis sort of axiomatic first principles of a philosophy of life leading to a philosophical anthropology, which results in the idea that humans have what he called eccentric positionality, meaning that we're embodied in two ways, not just one. So, you know, there are people in Europe, because he's not well known in the Anglophone world, who argue about, you know, Plesner versus Merleau-Ponty, for example. They see Plesner as having more richness in a certain sense. So for Plesner, there's both the experience of the body as a lived body, the Lieb, but also the sense of a body that we experience as an object in the world, the so-called corpor, right? And it occurs to me, for example, we go to the gym and we, you know, we use our body as like an instrument. You know, we force it to lift weights and so on, and you know, and treat it instrumentally, so that, you know, otherwise when we're, you know, out walking or maybe hanging out at the bar, whatever, you know, we feel a certain sense of vibrancy. You know, our lived body feels strong and vibrant and so on, right? So it seems to me that this would help in terms of your idea of incorporation, because I mean, in a sense, from Pleasant's point of view, this is intrinsic to what makes us biologically human. So it also changes the meaning of biology in a certain sense, right?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have a question about why incorporation? What about constitution, coupling? Why do you prefer that concept? And I don't know, I am not such a fan of extended mind thesis, but I think it's interesting how you put it in a more, I don't know, nice dialogue with phenomenology and more an activist point of views. But I don't know, why do you like extended mind?
No, I don't like it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jimena. No, incorporation, because it's the concept that came from Merleau-Ponty. Actually, it's curious because De Prester, when she critiques Merleau-Ponty, she's using the English translation in which they say incorporation, but Merleau-Ponty I don't remember the exact word in French, but in Spanish is adjunto, attached. It would be and I think that it's a different, has a different meaning, but I was discussing with the professor maybe, well, I was very interested in that paper because I think they was missing the point of Merleau-Ponty, because Merleau-Ponty is not talking about the body by itself, but in relation with the world. So I think this one, this part, the more important part was missing in that questioning of incorporation. So that's the reason I think maybe I can think if this we should use that concept, but was more like because my interest came from this paper, this discussion with incorporation. But actually, yes, Merleau-Ponty is not talking about incorporation, at least in our language. It's a good point. I'm gonna think. Sorry, extended mind. Why extended mind? No, it's the same. It's just I was interested in that discussion about a possibility of a phenomenology of that extended mind, because well, I wasn't sure about that thing that Clark said, that there is no need to talk about phenomenology when we are talking about extended mind, because these are subpersonal processes, and maybe we can discuss more about that claim. Maybe it's important to discuss this phenomenology, but yes, I maybe maybe just because the discussion came from that point. But of course, I am not interested in the functionalist point of view, or this perspective of how we attach others or incorporate. Well, I don't know, maybe we can find a better concept. But,
thank you very much.
okay.
Hi, Maria. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
So I'm curious about how to think about the puzzle example that the mother and child are doing the puzzle together, and how to think about incorporation of other people. So incorporation, I think, we start off from the body schema, and then we argue that sometimes that body schema can be incorporating things which are outside of the body, like the example of Merleau-Ponty of the lady that's wearing a hat with a feather in it, and she just ducks down when she walks through the door. So in order to argue that there's incorporation of other people, wouldn't it need to be the case that that the body schema of the child, when they're doing the puzzle with the mother, kind of extends to include, well, maybe you don't want to say extends, but that there's a shift in the boundaries, so that now the unit that you need to look at is the mother-child unit, so that you have something like what Tony called yesterday interpersonal synergies. So that the agent now is one that is not just the child on its own or the mother on its own, but the mother-child form a single system. And it wasn't obvious to me actually that that's what's happening in the puzzle example. So
Sorry, wasn't obvious?
It's not obvious to me that there's an interpersonal synergy that forms between the mother and the child in the puzzle example. No, so when the child is looking for the puzzle and says this one, no, that doesn't sound to me like there's enough there yet to say that there's an interpersonal synergy. So in the empirical literature, often people talk about the coordination dynamics. So you need to look at exactly what is happening between the child and the mother in order to say that there's this kind of synergy that they form. So I don't know if that example quite worked for me. And I know you were pushing for this idea of the experience and the givenness. And so there's something happening in the way that the puzzle piece maybe is given to the child that involves making reference to the mother. So you're thinking about joint attention there, maybe. And joint attention is what gets you a kind of first person plural givenness. Is that what you were arguing?
Okay, thank you. Yes, maybe I think it's maybe the point is that I missing some that we need to that I need to take into account what is happening in terms of that body schema. Yes, because I am thinking about the givenness, but and I think there is a way in which this givenness is from a first person perspective. It's not in some points, maybe this moment I need to rethink the example, but in some points at this experience, the mother is not present as a mother, but as this other, but the as you said, the way is part of my intentionality in some sense, but maybe something is missing here about body schema.
Just
Yes.
a suggestion for you for things that you could
Yes.
look at that might help you. So Merleau-Ponty had this idea of intercorporeality, and that's been taken up by Thomas Fuchs and Hannah Diego when they write about participatory sense making.
Yes.
So those sorts of examples, I think, like the people trying to pass each other in the corridor, they get stuck in this kind of corridor dance where one moves and then the other moves and they can't quite get past each other. Those sorts of examples, I think, are more like incorporation of the other than those sorts of examples of intercorporeality, I think, are what you need to think about.
Yes.
And that notion, I think, also, just by the way, points to why Lenny was not right to say that Merleau-Ponty was an individualist, because he had this idea of intersubjectivity already kind of at work in how he was thinking about the body, even in the early writing. So I think calling existential phenomenologists individualists doesn't really work for Merleau-Ponty. Maybe it does for Heidegger in the second division, but that's just an aside.
Thank you very much. Yes, I need to think deeply about it.
Okay, thank you very much. We're 10-minute break.
Artifacts as social scaffoldings for reasoning. Actually, this is a small, I will say a small piece of my big project. What I'm trying to do is to incorporate niche construction theory to explain the evolutionary origins of reasoning. So to do that, I have to do something like what I'm going to present to here. So the online is there's a debate on how explain cognition, if cognition is extended in the sense of Clark and Chalmers. But I'm going to argue that we can explain cognition in a more satisfactory way if we use the notion of Kim Sterenli, the scaffolded cognition. So there is something, there are social aspects of cognition that I think Clark and Chalmers cannot explain in the satisfactory way. So I'm going to explain artifactual reasoning using this notion of cognition, scaffold cognition. And I'm going to give some examples of how you can see the reasoning is artifactual. By artifactual reasoning, I mean the kind of reasoning that is embedded in artifacts. So the reasoning that is situated in material artifacts. And all that examples, I will say that are examples of how cognition is scaffolded or how social scaffoldings help us to explain reasoning. So there's the extended mind according to Clark and Chalmers, and some people have said that they explain mind based on parity principle. If an external resource plays the same functional role in supporting action as an action supporting internal resource that is uncontroversial cognitive, then the external resource is part of the cognitive system of the agent. You all know the example of Otto's notebook as an extension of the memory of Otto. And in this way is seen just like an extension of the internal processes or the internal mechanism. And that I will say has some objections, and the objections has to be with the social part of cognition. So I think the standard mind used examples more in individualistic paradigm. So that's why I'm using more scaffolded minds, according to Sterenli. The scaffolded mind hypothesis proposes that human cognitive capacities both depend on and have been transformed by environmental resources. So this is what I'm using to explain cognition. And reasoning debates, usually the way in which you explain cognition is the way in which you explain reasoning. So if I use this notion of social cognition, I think I can explain reasoning as a social. As I told you, I'm using this kind of literature to criticize Mercier and Sperber interactionist theory of reasoning. So what I'm saying is that Mercier and Sperber have like a nice theory of the origins of the evolutionary origins of reasoning, but they are not as that interactionist or social interactionist as they should be. So I'm using this to show them or to criticize them and at least point to a different way to understand social interaction. So for doing that, I'm using Feynman's diagrams. Feynman diagram is a representation of quantum field theory processes in terms of particle interactions. I'm using this example because I think Feynman diagrams give us an amazing example of how cognition is scaffolded in material artifacts. According to James Blake biography, it's a nice biography of Feynman, and he recounts the following. He, Feynman, began dating his scientific notes as he worked, something he had never done before. Weiner once remarked casually that his new partner notes represented a record of the day-to-day work, and Feynman reacted sharply. I actually did the work on the paper, he said. Well, Weiner said, the work was done in your head, but the record of it is still here. No, it's not a record. Not really. It's working. You have to work on paper, and this is the paper, okay? So this is an example of how Feynman himself saw his diagrams not just as an extension of his mind, but as a material artifacts that were constitutives of the reasoning processes. So there's I think, a pretty nice account of how Feynman diagrams were used in different communities of scientists. And David Kaiser has this book, and he has an account of how the diagrams can be seen as an artifact, or the diagrams enable types of reasoning that can be seen as what I'm calling artifactual reasoning. By the end of the 60s, Kaiser says, some physicists even wielded the line drawings for calculations in gravitational physics. With the diagram's aid, entire new calculational vistas opened for physicists. Theories learned to calculate things that many had barely dreamed possible before World War II. With the list of diagrammatic applications growing even longer, Feynman diagrams helped to transform the way physicists saw the world and their place with it. So this is an example of how Feynman diagrams were used in different ways for different communities of physicists. And not only that, but the Feynman diagrams enable different interpretations. During the 50s and 60s, Feynman diagrams did not compel by themselves a unique meaning or interpretation. They were drawn differently and mastered in different fashions to varying calculational and ultimately ontological ends. A spectrum emerged as physicists in very local settings made choices about what to work on, how best to deploy the hard-won tools, and what kinds of calculations their students should practice and master. Kaiser shows, I'm using Martinez here, Kaiser shows how the ways in which Feynman diagrams were drawn, used for calculation, and understood were quite diverse through the decades during which they spread and became part of the standard toolbox of a physicist. In order for Feynman's diagrams to spread and become a standard tool, physicists had to be trained and interpret and evaluate the results in a specific manner, and different sub-communities in physics have different standards of interpretations that were associated with different experimental or theoretical cultures. So what I'm saying here is that these kind of examples help us to understand that there are some material artifacts, in this case Feynman diagrams, that were used differently in different scientific communities, and that material artifact enabled different types of reasoning. So this is a way in which I'm using artifactual reasoning, or this is an example to say that reasoning takes place on artifacts. Another explanation or explication of this phenomenon is by Valeria Giardino. She works on diagrammatic reasoning, and I think that her proposal helped me to explain the way Feynman diagrams are or were used. Valeria Giardino has argued that diagrams or figures are inherently ambiguous. The operations on them are what fixes their meaning. Giardino's thesis is that diagrammatic reasoning must be seen in the context of specific scientific practices. in diagrammatic reasoning, what counts is not the appearance of the diagram and the list of explicit rules that can be applied to it, but a set of procedures. When a subject learns to use certain diagrammatic system to make some inferences, she learns a practice of manipulation. So Giardino holds that one aspect of the diagrams that become important in their inherent ambiguity, they can be read or interpreted in different ways. And the practice of their manipulation and the procedures applied to them fix their meaning. So what I'm saying is that these kind of explanations help us to see how reason and how different types of reasoning depend on the use and the familiarity with the subject with the artifact, or the subject with the material artifacts. So this is a quote from Kaiser. Feynman diagrams are clearly artifactual. In this sense, we might speak of them as construction or even as social constructions. Our task within post-constructivist science studies is to distinguish between kinds of constructions. The means by which construction makes sense for some scientists in particular times and places, how they spread among large and heterogeneous communities, and how scientists put these constructions to work, generating new ideas or providing a heuristic scaffolding for others. So what I'm saying here is that what enabled physicists to use Feynman diagrams for performing calculations was practice and familiarity with these artifacts. Feynman diagrams are an example not only of how reasoning can be understood as artifactual, but also how the interaction of reasoning subjects with material artifacts is a constitutive part of the reasoning process themselves. So given this, you can explain that phenomenon but in two ways, or two plausible but incompatible explications. The first one is artifacts merely express internal cognitive processes that take place prior to and independently of the expression, which is the extent in my proposal. And the second one, the one that I think is correct, is that artifacts have an active cognitive function to play in the very processes in question. So that's why I'm using this notion of the scaffolding mind. So the Feynman diagrams, I think, give us or are a very good example of how option 2 is the one that gives us a better account of how that processes emerge and develops. But I'm gonna use another example. In this case, another example from the history of science, Galileo's telescope. And I'm saying that if you see the Galileo's case, you can see something like what I'm seeing here as an artifactual reason. An example of how reasoning is artifactual can be found in Galileo's proposal in favor of the heliocentric conception of the universe. The reasoning used by Galileo depended on his use of an artifact, in this case, the telescope. For Galileo, the use and familiarity with the telescope constituted a proof in favor of Copernicus and of the very veracity of the telescope in terrestrial as well as terrestrial marks. And Martinez says the following, which I agree. Galileo's knowledge of technology required for the construction of telescopes, and in particular his expertise in the optical properties of many materials, support Galileo arguments against his opponents, that he is actually seeing what he claims to see. So this is an example in science of how if you see reasoning as artifactual, that counts like sufficient reasons in the exchange or in the different arguments against and in favor of some proposal. Another example comes from Dutil Novaes. She works in in different accounts of logic, especially the origins of logic. And she proposes that logic or some aspect of logic have their origins in dialogical practices. So, but I'm using here her notion of formal languages, and I think, and I'm arguing that her view of formal languages is a way in which you can see reasoning as artifactual. For her, external devices as formal languages do not merely facilitate the cognitive tasks, but are in fact constitutive of the cognitive processes in question. Dutil Novaes explains formal languages as a cognitive artifacts, enhancing and modifying an agent reasoning processes. Rather than merely expressing these cognitive processes a posteriori, engagement with formal languages is constitutive of these processes. And what I'm seeing here is a way to give more reasons why I'm using scaffolded cognition instead of extended mind hypothesis. Formal languages, says Novaes, are not merely secondary, albeit useful, devices for the cognitive processes involved when a logician is at work, rather than being the a posteriori expression of internal cognitive processes. They are constitutive elements of the relevant processes themselves. So again, this is a clear example how you can see material artifacts as constitutive of the reasoning process. Another example this is more an empirical example, and it comes from Landy and Goldstone, different papers they have. And Landy and Goldstone's work shows the significance of spatial perceptual features of symbolic notation for reasoning processes. So what I'm seeing here is that the agent bodily engagement with the notation is much more significant for the reasoning processes involved that is often assumed. Another example is the way Helen de Cruz and Johan de Smet use or the way they explain mathematical symbols. For them, mathematical symbols enable us to delegate some mathematical operations to the external environment. So in this view, mathematical symbols are not only used to express mathematical concepts, they are constitutive of the mathematical concepts themselves. In this way, mathematical symbols are epistemic actions because they enable us to represent concepts that are literally unthinkable with our bare brains. So we have another example here of mathematical reasoning and how even mathematical reason depend on the environment and material artifacts. And I would say that also on social interactions. In another example, you know the history of the heuristic and biases debates. Usually the way in which heuristic are seen in these debates is like formal operations inside the minds of the individuals, of the subjects. If reasoning is artifactual, as I'm saying, I think that we have excellent resources to explain how even heuristic reasoning can be seen in that way. And for that, I'm using Fonseca and Martinez. They argued that in philosophy and science, heuristics in behaviors, patterns, procedures, or methodological strategies embedded in artifacts that do not necessarily correspond to individualistic cognitive structures. So if you see reasoning as artifactual, you can explain heuristic reasoning in this way, embedded in scientific practices or situated in material artifacts. So in conclusion, taken together, these examples strongly suggest that rather than mere auxiliaries for the performance of internal cognitive processes based primarily on internal schemata and internal structural rules, manipulations of notations in logic, and as we saw, and also in mathematics, formal languages, diagrams, in the case of Feynman diagrams, and mathematical symbols are constitutive of these very cognitive processes, which is another way of saying that thinking or reasoning also takes place on artifacts, paper, telescopes, diagrams, and not only in the head. So to wrap up, this is a way, or the examples I show, I think are ways or are reasons to accept something like what I'm using schemes currently here to explain cognition, scaffolding cognition. So if you accept that reasoning is artifactual, you have a lot of examples of that. You can also have a very good view of the mind, embodied mind, to explain that. And I think at least the way I'm using this is for criticized theories like Mercier and Sperber, heuristic and biases tradition, the evolutionary psychology, computational theories of reasoning. And if you accept that reasoning can actually be artifactual, that's a good reason to reject the other recounts. Remember that I'm more interested in evolutionary origins of reasoning. So if this is right, I have good reasons to use another theory of evolution like Nietzsche's construction theory to explain how cognition develops, emerge, and stabilize through artifacts, especially through material artifacts. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Saul. Yeah.
Okay. Gracias, Saul. This is really interesting, particularly to me, because I've been working on artifactuality and so on. So I don't know if this is a question to you, maybe someone else also wants to take part on this, but I'm wondering what if you would be willing to then, if you're thinking of cognition as in part constituted by these material artifacts, if you think like another direction of advancement would be to now go on and talk about affordances of these elements, or if that would be like not appropriate because we wouldn't talk about maybe, I don't know, affordances of parts of our own cognition. So and then, so this is one question, and the other one is like, why the emphasis on material artifacts? Do you think that there's something else to say there?
Thank you. Great question. Yes, I think this account helps me to incorporate affordances. You know, in the literature of reasoning, usually reasoning is conceived something like infer something, a change of reasons. And in this way, I think you can see even reasons as affordances. Or you cannot conceive reasons in a particular community without seeing how the environment is structured or what counts as a reason. So it's a way to incorporate affordances as reasons, or affordances as the way in the environment is structured and gives you like, or enables you to reason about it. And the other one is material artifacts. It's just an example, but I think the reasoning also takes place in artifacts as language, or as some mathematical notions that are not necessarily material, but if you accept material, it's easier to accept the other one. At least in the way I'm explaining. Gracias.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I could go on forever.
Yes.
Así, no,
ahead.
yeah, well, I was wondering, because if you talk about material artifacts, I guess then the sexual importance could be done by the engagement with the material object. So you can
Yes.
talk about- Ah, sí.
Ya, ahora sí está en verde, perdón. So the idea was, if you talk about material artifacts, then you can go to talk about affordances in this material context. So, I mean, of course, it's important that the equation is written in the board at a size big enough for me to be able to read it from afar if I'm a student, so on and so forth. But if you talk about notation, then yeah, I think then you're going into a probably a more abstract realm, unless you want to say that notation is somehow something you abstract from different instances and it's still material, which I think is probably difficult to do. So yeah, I guess I would press you to, so what I don't see is how the reasons could be affordances though. I mean, I can understand that you could say, yeah, of course, something will be a reason or not, depending on the environment, and certain environments afford certain kinds of reasons. So what is a good reason in certain epistemic circles will not be in others. So in that sense, I can see that. Maybe that's what you mean.
Yes, in that sense, in practical reasoning, and also in this kind of reasoning that I'm thinking. But the important thing is to conceive reasoning not as something that relies or it's in the head of the individuals, but something that stabilizes or emerges in the interaction with material objects or the environment in general.
Okay.
Thanks, I really enjoyed that. So I'm kind of following up on the last question and suggesting that maybe there is a way to think about the diagrams and the formal languages as affordances, but once you make that move, then I don't think it's necessary anymore to talk about scaffolding of cognition. Just think about the Feynman diagrams as an example of what I was talking about, of how affordances form in practices. So Feynman initiated this practice of making these drawings that then other scientists join in, and the reasoning happens through the engagement with the diagram. So the diagram is offering certain kinds of affordances as a material structure that's drawn, and it's in the engagement with the diagram that the thinking happens. But if you think of it in those terms, then you're looking at a system or a relation where there isn't there's a unity of the agent and the diagram, and the thinking happens through that unity that forms. So instead of thinking that there's an agent and then their boundary is kind of scaffolded by what's outside of them, you've got a kind of inside-outside relation there. Thinking in terms of affordances would mean that you don't start from that boundary and then some things in the environment allow you to think things you wouldn't be able to think otherwise, but instead you start from the relation of the agent and the diagrams that allow for a certain kind of thinking. So an affordance way of describing this, an ecological way of describing it, I think would mean that you no longer need this notion of scaffolding or extension. Instead, you would opt for material engagement, maybe, as a way of thinking about this, to use the Malaforis idea.
Yes. I
or
completely
skilled
agree.
intentionality.
Yes, I completely agree. I actually, the way and I gave the presentation is a small part of what I'm doing in a larger project, and I'm seeing this as a criticism of Mercier and Sperber's notion of reasoning. So they think reasoning is a cognitive module. So if I show just that, it's enough to criticize them. But I have to propose something like I have
I'm not sure that scaffolding is enough to criticize them, actually. So the idea of scaffolding was kind of introduced so that you've got this middle ground where you can say that, well, structures in the environment are kind of important, but still all of the cognition happens inside of the head. So there's a kind of dependence on the environment,
yes.
But and that dependence might be such that were that diagram not drawn, then Feynman wouldn't be able to solve the scientific problems because he causally depends on the diagram. But still, the reasoning
yes.
that leads him to solve the problem is done inside of the head. And that's consistent with talking about scaffolding here. So
yes, but
I don't think that
scaffolding.
that Sperber and would need to reject what you're saying here, actually, when you put it in terms of scaffolding.
Yeah, I'm using the Kim-Sterling notion, not just like not just to say that material objects are important to cognition, but to show the constitutive elements that cannot be explained by the modular notion. So in this case, Feynman example is a very good example because it's not just what Feynman did, it's what communities of scientists did after the diagrams were invented by Feynman. And that the way in which diagrams were used after Feynman were not equal in different communities. So there were not like a translation rule to use it in a community and to use it in the same way. There were different ways in which they were used.
Yeah, it's a fascinating example. Thanks.
Thank you.
¿Puedo plantear mi pregunta en español?
Por favor.
Sí, muchas gracias. Bueno, creo que va muy de la mano con lo que se acaba de preguntar. Al escuchar tu presentación, yo me preguntaba justo si considerabas que ahora veo que, pues sí, o sea, veo, es una muestra de un trabajo más grande, pero yo me preguntaba si sería pertinente un enfoque, por ejemplo, un poco más explícito desde la antropología evolutiva o incluso desde la biología evolutiva o la ecología de la conducta, pensando en que el razonamiento puede ser pues una conducta, o sea, una expresión conductual que está sujeta a presiones selectivas, ¿no? En donde pues esas presiones de selección en algunas especies podrían ser autoinducidas. Estoy pensando, por ejemplo, en esta premisa del fenotipo extendido, en donde algunas especies como, pues, no sé, las aves que construyen nidos, ¿no? O los castores que hacen presas, y que a partir de una modificación del ambiente por parte de los individuos están produciendo adecuaciones conductuales y procesos específicos que tienen que ver con esa intervención en el ambiente. En cuyo caso, ¿qué tanto de esto? Pues más bien quiero, o sea, mi pregunta inicial era como, ¿qué tanto habías considerado? Veo que sí, pero ¿qué tanto podríamos pasar social scaffoldings no solo a comunidades, por ejemplo, humanas, sino en realidad como un proceso que podría no solo afectar la cognición humana, sino la cognición viéndola en términos conductuales y modificación a partir pues del ambiente? ¿Qué tanto podríamos decir que social scaffoldings también aplicaría en algunas otras especies, ¿no? Más allá de lo meramente humano. Entonces, muchas gracias.
Gracias. Te puedo contestar en español, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Sí, mejor. Sí, de hecho, esa es parte esencial de mi propuesta. Yo lo que estoy haciendo es diciendo como que en la manera en que tú explicas los orígenes cognitivos de la cognición determinan cómo explica los orígenes cognitivos del razonamiento. Entonces estoy tratando de juntar dos tradiciones, una que habla de qué es el razonamiento, que no necesariamente se pregunta por los orígenes evolutivos del mismo, y estoy juntando esa tradición con estas propuestas que hablan sobre específicamente los orígenes evolutivos del razonamiento. Entonces lo que yo estoy diciendo es que la mayor parte de la literatura que tenemos del razonamiento toman la teoría evolutiva del adaptacionismo. Y eso está muy ligado a los recuentos modulares de la psicología evolucionista. Entonces, una vez que tú quitas el adaptacionismo, piensas en nuevas maneras de estructurar la cognición a través de procesos evolutivos que tengan que ver más con el desarrollo y la estructuración de nichos, el razonamiento en qué es, tendrías que estructurarlo y explicarlo de una manera distinta. En este caso, yo digo que construcción de nichos nos puede ayudar no solamente a romper con supuestos individualistas y fijos y estables del adaptacionismo, sino que nos puede ayudar a cómo precisamente se presentan este tipo de factores, ¿no? Como los diagramas de Feynman y los procesos de razonamiento que surgen a través de ellos. Entonces, en ese sentido, si yo estoy utilizando construcción de nichos, pues eso me puede decir mucho a través de comunidades de especies de animales no humanos. Y tenemos ejemplos de cómo los perros desarrollan cierto tipo de capacidades con su evolución con los humanos, o cómo algunos animales hacen cierto tipo de inferencias transitivas. Y todo eso se puede explicar a través de cómo estructuran el nicho y a la vez de cómo ese nicho los está modificando a ellos y cómo esos procesos de razonamiento se explican dentro de ese nicho. Pero sí, es muy interesante, es parte de lo que quiero avanzar. Gracias.
I think it would be fair to say that most species have fine-tuned physiological response patterns to natural stimuli. Now, the question is it possible that that the role of artifacts in human, I would say, hominin reasoning or reckoning is part of a long evolutionary history of compensation for the loss of those adaptive physiological response patterns, right? So in that sense, Feynman's diagrams are part of a continuity that goes back to the use of the Acheulean hand axe by Homo erectus and things of that sort. And that would support your choice for calling the role of artifacts as constitutive. You know, in some sense, it's an hominin handicap. We can't help but be constitutively dependent upon artifacts as compensation. But then it opens up all of this, world of contingencies that leads to Feynman's diagrams and so on.
Yes. I think this kind of examples in what I'm interested in is to explain the evolutionary origins of reasoning, and I think that has to be with what you said. So I completely agree. Yes, and reasoning can also be seen as something we use to plan action, for example, to coordinate action, to develop like something like collective intentionality, and some of that. I think reasoning helps.
But as you say, reasoning is never monological. Like it's dependent upon reasoning is out there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's a way.
Somebody else? Okay, so thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, so
Bueno,
now the cherish of the cake, as they say, and we can take it.
bueno, so I am going to talk about entrainment. Basically, I'm trying to develop a different way of understanding the sense in which affordances are diachronically constituted. Different sense of what I see in the literature. I am not sure if it is different from what Julian says, but I suspect there are some differences. But in any case, as far as I see, I would say that what I'm going to say is perfectly compatible with post-cognitivist psychology. Just that I would say that it's post-cognitive psychology plus anthropology plus social sciences. That I think so you two could say. So the idea of entrainment is an idea that starts in physics in the 17th century, and is an idea that that basically refers to processes that can be seen as distinctive of the organization of life. Is not the only basic process distinctive of the organization of life, you know, several others, temporally organizing the interactions of an organism with the world. That's what I am interested in, the concept of entrainment, because it has been used a lot. First of all, in relation with dynamical system theory, that I think so plays an important role in what I am going to say, even though I am not going to talk much about that. No? That it is a principle that allows us to understand, explain how we temporally organize the interactions of an organism with the world. Processes of entrainment in biological organisms generate irreducible affordances constitutive of developmental processes which have an evolutionary significance. I am saying that just that you better understand what I am saying. The basic of what I am going to say. That's basically developmental system theory, you know, a basic idea in developmental system theory. This is going to help me to, let's say, I'm going to connect this discussion of entrainment with this basic idea of this way of understanding evolutionary significance and the way in which the environment can be seen as causes for evolution. Such affordances scaffold a kind of intentionality, which in turn support or set the stage for the development of social cognition and more specific kinds of intentionality. I was planning to say much more about social cognition and intentionality. I'm going to say very little, because if I do, then I just will spend time in saying what is or what is not social cognition. And I think that I prefer going in another direction. I will say some very minimal things about that. Also, another important thing, in the sense that I'm going to use intentionality is not the sense in which Hutto and Min use this intentionality. That's important because it can be confusing, but I think so. Well, I will explain, or it will be clear in what I am going to say, what I mean with intentionality. That I think so is much more closer to a skill intentionality framework than to Hutto and Min. I completely agree with the critique of from Julian and Eric and others of this idea in Hutto. No? But I think that the idea of intentionality, the term of intentionality, I was thinking not to use it because they use it, and I don't see why. No, I just have to. It's sufficient to say that it's not the same. No. So in what sense this intentionality is a basic kind of collective intentionality by relating it to the cultivation of capacities for attention. The basic idea that I'm working on for already a while is that the temporal organization of experience involves in a very important way the connection between entrainment and attention. So bringing in this
important relation allows us to connect it with important discussions in psychology and in a general cognition, theory of cognition. An explanation of cognition, and in particular an explanation of what is social cognition or intentionality, assumes implicitly or explicitly a narrative of the way human cognition evolved. If we have the wrong narrative, the explanation flounders. That is basically, I am assuming that if we want to have a good explanation of cognition, we have to have the right account of the evolution of cognition. And then, of course, we might discuss what is this right account of cognition, but we cannot avoid this discussion. And basically, I already told you more or less what would be this basic account of cognition of evolution I am going to assume. Now, this is a video I want you to shoot. Gracias. This is an example of entrainment in physics. And you will see what is okay. It's impressive, no? This complex organization, no? Just out of very simple internal source of activity, no? And they immediately find patterns of self-organization. Of course, one thing that I am interested in is the connection between self-organization and entrainment. There is a lot about that, no? But I really don't have very clear some questions about that, so I'm not going to get into that. But you see, this is how it seems to stop, no? Oh no, it's again. It seems like magic, no? Well, okay, thank you. And then now can I come back here? Yeah. Okay. Well, this is an example of what is entrainment. No? The concept of entrainment. There is a quite interesting history in physics. It was invented, it was discovered by Huygens in the 17th century. And it then developed quite a lot, of course, particularly through modeling with dynamical system theory in the late 20th century and until now. No? And it started being developed very much as the idea of entrainment as a universal concept in nonlinear sciences, particularly by the influence of this book of Minsky, Rosenblum, and Kortz. Systems as diverse as clocks, singing crickets, cardiac pacemakers, firing neurons, and applauding audience exhibit a tendency to operate in synchrony. These phenomena are universal and can be understood within a common framework based on modern nonlinear dynamics. Esta es la descripción del libro, ¿no? The first half of this book describes synchronization without formula and is based on qualitative intuitive ideas. That's what makes very attractive to use, no? The second half of the book presents the main effects of synchronization in a rigorous and systematic manner, describing both classical results on synchronization of periodic oscillators and recent developments in chaotic systems, large ensembles, and oscillatory media. Now, there are a lot of things that we could say just about the way in which they formulate things. Notice first that they move from
they basically move from entrainment to synchrony. No, that is very common in physics. No, synchronization and entrainment are basically the same thing for many people. No, depending of what sort of application or in what sort of field you are using it. But actually, I think that it's better to keep them separate. I better think of entrainment as the sort of processes that lead to synchronization, the sort of process that lead to synchronization. And in that sense, there is a simple distinction. This is a libro. Now, very soon, at the end of in the second half of the 20th century, this idea of entrainment entered biology and really was very, very important in biology, and it has been very important since then. No, there is a very influential paper by Ashoff, and then an explosive growth of research on this topic. And this is a more recent article in the Journal of Biological Rhythms. There are dozens of journals about this topic. No? And the circadian system actively synchronizes the temporal sequence of biological functions with the environment. The oscillatory behavior of the system ensures that entrainment is not passive or driven, and therefore allows for great plasticity and adaptive potential. With the tools at hand, we now can concentrate on the most important circadian question. How is this complex task of entrainment achieved by anatomical, cellular, and molecular components? Understanding entrainment is equal to understanding the circadian system. The results of this basic research will help us to understand temporal ecology and will allow us to improve conditions for human industrialized societies. You see, it is quite ambitious, the project, and I think so they are right. They are quite important topics, no? And also this idea of temporal ecology is important because I think so that certainly, again, they are very much thinking about how to understand the temporal, how to understand this temporal organization of biological processes. So entrainment refers to processes of synchronization resulting from the interaction of interdependent rhythmic systems, and such that the synchronization tend to be restored under perturbations. That is the very basic idea of entrainment, say, as I am going to use it. Okay, it's important the idea that that has to be restored on the perturbations. There are several different ways of talking of entrainment also. For example, locking in, no? That is also important. You will see why it is often used in locking in instead of entrainment. What is entrainment? What I have said is there is entrainment in physics, there is entrainment in biology. In physics has been very important. In biology it has been very important when we talk about circadian rhythms. And it has been very important in many different areas of the relation between biology and the social sciences. And there is an interesting example that I think so will show you how it is important to understand also human behavior. Is the example of Pokemon's vaccine bomb. Pokemon is a person from caricatures, no, for children. No? All of you know that. Well, this is a famous something that happened in Japan in 1997, I think so it was, no, that. In a TV program, no, Pokemon throws a vaccine bomb, no, on the screen, and the screen flashes very, very strongly, no, and it generated dozens of children that have to go to the hospital because their neural system entered in resonance with the flashes in the screen, no? And that. Of course, I don't know if you have seen now that often when even in movies now, sometimes said a warning, there are some stroboscopic lights or something like that. No? That is, well, in partly is that's the reason. The concept of entrainment has had a lot of applications in the social sciences, but there is one important question. No? Are we talking of the same concept, or are we just talking of an extension of the concept to the social sciences? No? It wouldn't matter much, no? But I think it's important. I think that basically we are talking about the same concept, that the idea in the sense that entrainment is a universal concept, extends to the social sciences. And I think so that's why, but that's something that need to be argued for. No, is the concept of entrainment really that used in the social sciences the same as it is used in biology, as it is used in physics? No, it is not difficult to see that the use in biology and physics is the same. Particularly if you think that dynamical system theory work very well there, and well, there are several reasons, but this is not the problem. But once you go to the social sciences, this might be a problem. And this is a problem that enters into the discussion later. Now I'm going to talk about that. The idea of entrainment in the social sciences and the idea of social entrainment in particular was introduced in a well-known paper by McGrath and Kelly in 1996 to provide a general framework for explaining some kinds of social behavior over time. McGrath and Kelly entrainment describes the interaction of human social rhythms, including rhythmic processes within one individual. Social entrainment refers to all cycles of behavior at the individual, group, or organizational level that are captured and modified by one another or by external pacer. So this is basically the idea of the social entrainment of McGrath and Kelly. Now, the question is, how can we see that we are talking about the same concept in this sort of discussions? Now, this question has been addressed by a few people actually, but there are discussions about that. But one of the most interesting discussions is in musicology. In musicology, musicologists were very interested in this idea and trying to understand music as social behavior and how music had to do with social entrainment. There is an obvious sense in which music has to do with social entrainment, no? And you will see why. So musicologists were particularly interested in this idea of social entrainment, and then they developed the idea through several decades, and they have done a very good work on formulating, clarifying different notions of entrainment, and in a way allow us to think that they were talking about the same thing. Some of these people are also using dynamical system theory to model musical behavior, or what is called musicking, that refers to our practice of music, our music as an interactive activity. No, that's why they use musicking instead of music. No, and I am going to use this term. But there is a famous article of Clayton, Seger, and Will in 2005 where they try to characterize clearly what is entrainment in musicology, the sort of, in order to use it to develop a lot of experiments in about music. No? Entrainment, says, requires autonomous oscillators having an internal source of power, which enables them to oscillate with its natural frequency, regardless of interaction. The phase relationship has to be constant and stable. And the entrained system has the behavioral disposition to reassert its stability after perturbation. These are the three basic the three things that a system has to satisfy in order to enter in entrainment with other systems. No? Now, something interesting here is that implicit here there is a notion of autonomy that is, yeah, I think so. It's quite interesting. It is not the notion of autonomy in an activism, but I think so. It is an interesting notion to discuss. For example, collective intentionality, or what what is collective intention or what is collective intentionality. I'm going to come to that, but basically notice, no, autonomous oscillator, it involves phase relationship, constant and stable. So you have a system in which there is a phase relation. So what you have to make clear is that you have autonomous systems with phase relationships that satisfy these conditions. There is implicit there a notion of autonomy. I don't know you see, but this is a notion of something that is autonomous, but in a different sense than what is usually understood of autonomy. Now, a central claim of Clayton is that entrainment is a factor in any variety of music, in any way of in any musical activity. Let me better try to argue for what I am trying to do. I jump from physics to musicology, and then you say, well, but what has to do that with cognition? No? Well, I think so. Music has a lot to do with cognition. And I would say that music is one of the best examples we have of social cognition. And that if we are going to understand what is social cognition, we have to understand music and art. And then we should focus on understanding what is artistic activity and what is art, not understood in our sense, in our Western sense of art as something related with elites, no, but art more as Helen Disayanaki says, as a universal capacity of human beings. No? Art in this sense of universal capacity of human beings is, I think so, a very important ground, source of insights about what cognition is. And I am doing that in terms of, for here in this case, for music. Well, that is the connection. No? If we, let's say, it is not simply, I am interested in social cognition, I am interested in the idea of, as they did that in this tradition, no? They moved from the idea of social entrainment to this idea of entrainment and music. No? And what they are saying, I would say, and we try to show it now, even though I will not have time for that, but I think so it can be done very well. It has quite interesting consequences for discussions on cognition. Another important paper in this direction, in trying to understand exactly on how to use entrainment in musicology, is an article by Jessica Phillips Silver and others, no? In which entrainment has been studied, they say, in a variety of contexts, including music perception, dance, verbal communication, and motor coordination more generally. Here we seek to provide a unifying framework that incorporates the key aspects of entrainment as it has been studied in these varying domains. You see, they keep trying to get a uniform concept of entrainment so that their program of using this idea in musicology can progress or can advance. We propose that there are a number of types of entrainment that build upon pre-existing adaptations that allow organisms to perceive stimuli as rhythmic, to produce periodic stimuli, and to integrate the two using sensory feedback. We suggest that social entrainment is a special case of spatio-temporal coordination where the rhythmic signals originate from another individual. I have a slight disagreement with this way of characterizing social entrainment, but for now it doesn't matter much. You will see maybe later. But what is important here, you see, social entrainment, they are trying to characterize in a better way, more clear way, what is social entrainment in musicology, and they characterize it as spatio-temporal coordination, where the rhythmic signals originates from, let's say, from somewhere else. Doesn't need to be an individual. No? And then they use this framework to understand the function and evolutionary basis for coordinated rhythmic movement. And they have done that as part of the research recently. Philip Silver distinguished 3 kinds of social entrainment. They are continuing this program. No? What is social entrainment in musicology and how find different ways of characterizing it. Simple social entrainment, simply say you listening to music, one person listening to music. Mutual social entrainment, in which say two persons are playing together, for example, guitar. And collective social entrainment. And this is what is interesting and what is related with my comment before. This kind of entrainment can emerge within a collective without necessarily consisting of a for or mutual interaction, of mutual interaction. That I think so, why it is a good example of a social cognition or a collective intentionality. I would say that in music there is intentionality, or a collective intentionality that doesn't need to, that cannot be seen as the aggregation of individual intentionalities or the aggregation of individual cognition. They elaborate this. They have also a lot of things to say about that. But the important thing is that here it's clear that there is this idea of entrainment emerging from a collective without necessarily being an aggregation of individual systems. The importance of this kind of entrainment is related with the recognition of music as material culture. I think that's something that we have worked in a paper a couple of years ago. And this is precisely this idea of entrainment precisely in music. This is precisely about the music as material culture, because basically we are trying to argue that that it is in material culture where the collective intentionality of music is embodied. No? And this and that this material culture can involve whatever you can. Even in a way, it can involve instruments, or it can even involve the human voice. Now I will jump a bit and go very much faster, no? Just to say a little bit about where I am heading. I think Philip Silver supports the idea that music offers a very clear example of social cognition and collective intentionality that is not a mere aggregation of individual cognitions. How about thinking of music as a paradigmatic case of cognition? How about thinking that music can serve us as a major explanatory resource for understanding what is cognition, and in particular, what can be social cognition or intentionality? Might not be a better point of departure than language for formulating and answer some key questions about cognition? I think so, yes. No? And what sort of questions would be important? Well, I am not going to say now. The suggestion that entrainment refers to a kind of universal kind of phenomena that can allow us to understand cognition as a basic feature of life, I think so. The basic answer is that the answer is written. Yo creo que me salté uno, ¿no? No, well, it's a question, no? How about thinking that music can serve as this, no? And then might not be a better point of departure. And then there is the problem of, say, this is in relation to the basic question of how can we be sure that we are talking about the same notion of entrainment. No? There are more than this, but there is more than this in the answer, but I think so the answer is yes. No? We are talking about the same sort of phenomena in a very important scientific sense. No? But in this case, no, what allows us to ground this answer is that rhythm plays a very important sense, that rhythm is very universal and common in all human experience and in all human activities, not only music, no? And that rhythm, as musicologists often say, no, is the temporal organization of music. And then why not to think that rhythm is the temporal organization of all of our experience? No? And this could be, in particular, I think that would lead us to a notion of affordances as diachronically constituted, no, where rhythm plays an important role in how they are constituted diachronically. And I'm going to give you some nice examples. I have 50 or more examples, like quotations like that from everywhere. No? Novalis is a famous poet from 18th century, says that hat man den Rhythmus der Welt weg, so hat man auch die Welt weg. If one has dispensed with the rhythm of the world, then has dispensed with the world as well. That's a nice quote, no? So in other words, you see what he's saying, and this is said a lot, for example, in this time, it has to do with the development of Romanticism and so on, what Lenny was also saying, no, about the importance of rhythm as a constitutive of human self, of what is a human in the world, something like that. This idea is developed in a lot of literature and a lot of art and in a lot of sort of philosophical work that basically is unknown to us now. They are not, of course, they say they are much earlier than what the sort of development I was talking about before. The rhythm, that rhythm plays an important role in music and the arts is widely recognized. There are plenty of work in musicology, psychobiology, anthropology, and you name it, whatever disciplines pointing to the importance of rhythm as constitutive of human practices. The importance of the concept of rhythm in painting is a constant in discussion of theories of painting practices. Roque has written extensively on the importance of the important theoretical role, theoretical in the sense that abstract painters were very much involved in a discussion about what they were doing and why it was important, no? And that had a lot to do with what was abstract painting. No? I started being interested on that because I'm interested in the idea of abstraction, but I end up connecting it with that. Yolaine Escande, a historian of art and Chinese gardens in particular, has written extensively about the importance of rhythm in classical Chinese painting. The rhythm of the strokes has to harmonize with the rhythm of the world. It's very clear, no? I said, what is this connection? No? For example, Chinese painters have to start learning how to breathe, because if they don't know how to breathe, they will not be able to paint. No? And for example, the gardens are constructed in such a way that reflect this basic idea of resonance with the world. The garden has to resonate with the natural rhythm of the environment. One garden in one place cannot be in another place. In the idea of Chinese garden, no, a garden is a garden in one place, no, surrounded by certain in a landscape. And this is one kind of well, no, sorry, oops. No, okay. Lo apagué. Ya estaba. One second. So I just want to show you. Es que. Well, I have quite a lot of. Well, I will leave that. But I have some other examples of people talking in arts in art and painting about the importance of rhythm. Mondrian, for example, thought that jazz was very important as a musical expression because of his revolutionary, because the music promoted a kind of a change in social in the way in which in general art was seen and human relations in general. You know? He had very clear these ideas, and this is very common in a lot of painters in this time. For example, the way in which rhythm is manipulated in the making of music is a very important source of innovation. Tony mentioned something in this direction. No? Is it the way in which, and this, so rhythm in a sense is like, say, something that is internal to the musicking, but can turn into a factor of change for the way in which the music develops. And another different strand of argument in this direction that music is very important to understand what cognition is work done by a lot of people in musical psychology and psychobiology. Malo Entrevarten, por ejemplo, says musicality between mothers and infants is the ground for all human communication. That's not a modest thesis, isn't it? But I think so. Basically, they are right. No? Musicality with mothers and infants is the ground for all human communication. So then, I guess we should think, if we want to understand what is communication, what is cognition, well, pay more attention to this, the sort of work they are doing. That is not just plain talking, but there is a lot of experimental work involved with this. No, they have very sophisticated laboratories in different parts of the world studying these sort of things. And a lot of this work is done using dynamical system theory. Musicality between mothers and infants is the ground of all human communication. This mother-infant attachment leads to the training. It leads to the training in the entrainment of attention that will play a crucial role in the development of all cognitive processes that from the action perceptual cycles lead to the development of skills, habits, and mature forms of cognition. This communicative musicality trains the infant in the rhythmicity of human communication and allows the infant to pay attention to what is relevant to pay attention. That's the connection with rhythmicity and attention are closely connected in human cognition. And that has to be taken in consideration if we want to understand human affordances, I think. And also, the idea, remember the basic idea in music that one can extend, that rhythm is temporal organization. So what we are saying here is if this sort of generalization can be made, I think so it can be made, no? Then the way in which human beings solve a lot of problems of poor information in the world, it's just that they are not looking for information, but for rhythms in the world that lead the attention in the direction that is already, will allow them to develop according to a certain culture and in a certain culture. You see, that's the basic idea, no? That attention and rhythm are very closely related and play a role in this temporal organization of experience. Now, this is a more recent work of Clayton. Well, they propose a new model that distinguishes between different components of interpersonal entrainment. A lot of work in laboratory. Sensory motor synchronization, a largely automatic process, manifests especially with rhythms based on periodicities in the 100 to 100 milliseconds time scale, and coordination extending over longer time scales and more accessible to conscious control. So they have come to the conclusion that it could be a good idea to make this distinction between sensory motor synchronization and coordination. I think so. It is an important distinction, but it is basically it will depend of what are the questions you're pursuing, whether this should be something formulated more generally. But the important thing of this work of Clayton is that it's showing you that, for example, this coordination that takes place at 100, 200 milliseconds certainly is not conscious, no? But it is a very important kind of coordination that play a key role in musicking, and not only music. For example, also there are also work on that in human dialogues, for example, no? And also in animals. Now, there are several questions, of course, in what I am saying that remain. How rhythm plays a causal role in the sort of evolution suggested here, and that is where enters the idea of attention. No? There are plenty of evidence, particularly if we take seriously art and music as paradigmatic cognition, that rhythm and the development of our capacities for attentions are related, very closely related. This close connection between entrainment and attention allows to explain how rhythm can promote the integration of environmental causes in development. The environment is also rhythmically structured. And then finally, that is a quotation for a book that is called The Ethics of Attention. And by the way, this name is the name of the last chapter of a book of Cor van der Velde on developmental system theory, The Ethics of Attention. What if we took seriously the possibility that attention is truly an activity where we join the world so closely that in attention there really is no self? That would do justice to the experience that in attention there is nothing but what we are attending to it. Would also mean to take literally the idea of unselfing, removing or dissolving the self. I think so that this approach that I am pursuing suggests that that we should explore this possibility. At least this is a book on using Iris Murdoch philosophy, and that's basically this is basically a development of the ideas of Iris Murdoch and Simone Weil. Well, that's basically the idea. Thank you.
I think this was a great, fascinating talk, Sergio. Thank you. A few thoughts in relationship to it. I mean, very good thinkers like Emil Durkheim, would argue that human sociality is based on ritual.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if we think about ritual, it
right, that is right. No, definitely.
And rhythm,
right.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
The cognitive scientist Merlin Donald, well, I could say much more about, but points out interestingly that all and only humans have rhythm, right? Can dance.
Mm-hmm.
All and only. We don't all dance equally well. I mean, I must say, but we can all dance, meaning that we can use any part of our body to syncopate.
Mm-hmm.
And that can't be for no reason. But I want to entertain the possibility that entrainment ritual via entrainment, is compensatory, right? It's part of the compensation. And so in that sense, it's not exactly the same for other animals who can't dance. And I think that could open up some sort of social diagnostic issues, right? So, I mean, in other words, what happens when we lose it? Now, it came to my attention recently that the ancient Greeks, prior to Socrates, in the oral traditions that were expressed in the Odyssey and in the Iliad, first of all, are written in poetry. I mean, the wise
Mhm.
people, the oracles and so on, they all spoke in poetry in the sense they spoke rhythmically. Right? And it's only been, one could say, it's only been for the last 2,500 years, 2,800 years, that we don't communicate in rhythm. And it's the same period of time that various philosophers like Heidegger and his Seinsgeschichte, his history of being, and Foucault and so on, think that we've been on a trajectory leading to disaster. So, I mean, what happens when we increasingly lose rhythm-based entrainment and become individualized? I mean, it's a self that disappears, a kind of historical pathology that's only 2,500 years old, right? So, I mean, one maybe provocative thought is, might it explain things like the phenomenon of crazy conspiracy theories that are quite prominent north of the border, QAnon and so on, as a kind of compensatory form of ritualistic entrainment. Right? There's no way to account for them in empirical rational terms. They form a kind of compensation for the loss of social entrainment through ritual. Yeah.
I have this. Yeah, sure. I agree with you. I agree with you that there are things to explore. No, I don't know. But you see, the basic point that I guess I didn't formulate is, well, one thing is that there are work with animals that are related, even with social insects, for example, that suggest that the importance of coordination and the role of process of entrainment. But in the communication, in the way in which they communicate. You know? If you disrupt the entrainment process that they usually use, there can be no, the sort of communication that is optimal for their work disappears, no? Or is, well, so certainly, but I think so there are a lot of things to explore on that. The point is that, I think that this, I guess, is clear that this points to a way in which, say, the temporal organization of experience via entrainment, synchronization, lock-in, whatever, plays or should play a very important role in understanding or modeling cognition.
I mean, I just want to say, I think it's certainly possible to think that in hominin evolution, you have a repurposing of the physics of the dynamics
exactly.
of the trainers, right? So it could be continuity and discontinuity.
Well.
Yeah.
Mine is a brief question anyway. Hello, Sergio. Yes, by the end of the talk, more and more I was remembering about conversations and publications from people talking about complexity, dynamic systems, no, living and non-living. So they usually talk about stuff such as redundance and robustness. What about those terms in your system?
They are quite important here. I avoided that, robustness and entrenchment. I avoided that because I have already too many terms in the discussion. But I think so they're very crucial to make more robust my claims.
Thank you.
But certainly, you know that I am a fan of robustness and entrenchment.
So I was hoping that Vincente would ask this question, but I'm going to do it instead. Now, what's the relationship between your notion of entrainment and resonance, as we heard about at the end of yesterday? And I can't help but mention Carl Friston, who I know many people here are not fans of, but he has this generalized synchrony as an example of how to think about what he calls free energy minimization. So the way that your biological dynamics are synchronizing with the dynamics within the environment, the external dynamics. So free energy minimization, he thinks of in terms of something very similar to what you're describing in terms of entrainment. And obviously he thinks that this is a principle that explains everything. It's a unifying theory. So he would argue that from that notion of entrainment, understood in terms of free energy minimization, you can get to social behaviors as well. So I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but I wondered if you wanted
I guess
to...
I don't think that I am pretending to be so ambitious in saying that that will explain social behavior. But I think that this is an important contribution to understand how we are going to characterize social cognition and a social intentionality. Now, what we do with that, well.
Yeah, so Friston has a similar idea in a paper with Chris Frith, where they use songbird synchronization as a kind of model for social behavior, for collective intentionality. Are you familiar with the literature on alignment as well, which they often use this notion of entrainment in that literature too? So when in a conversation, you'll see like same kinds of sentence structures coming up, words repeated. And
there are work on that coordination even at the level of brain waves, no?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, this is but I don't know if you see or you would agree that basically if you take in consideration rhythm as an important component of human interactions, that gives you a resource to understand the diachronic constitution of affordances.
I need to think more about that. Yeah. So I can see how there's a temporality to rhythm. Yeah. And certainly I want to argue that. But
the thing is that
you get
see
affordances out of rhythmic interactions. So that seems like a little bit of a stretch there from the notion of that interactions are organized in a rhythmic way between people, to thinking that the structure in the environment that forms out of those interactions is also explainable in terms of that rhythm, that entrainment. But I think I would probably agree with you. That's a component. That's an important component.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Sergio. I have a question about this biological dynamics. I know that action potential of neurons are the ones that get entrained with this music, for example. But I don't know. I don't want to get in this neuroreductionism. Can we think about another kind of processes in these biological dynamics that get into this entrained with?
What I said that had nothing to do with neuroreductionism. No?
I know, but I am thinking in this because I suppose that that we get entrained because we have a lot of neurons rhythms and a lot of biological rhythms.
Right. Say the coordination that happens in the interaction between two persons in a dialogue or playing music together, it is manifested in a synchronization of brainwaves, but also in the movement of the hands, in the movement of the eyes, in the movement of the whole body. No? So it is not just at the level of the brain. It's the whole body that is involved in this rhythmic interaction.
Okay, thank you.
Would you get this entrainment between people that are playing music separated, for example, through internet, like they're both playing at the same time, but mediated by the digital technology? Would you get this entrainment, or do you need the physical presence of the other?
I don't know. I see that there is a work on that, but I would suspect that to some extent, yes. If you're an experienced musician, for sure you can do it. But if not, I for sure that you lose something. No, if you are not, for example, I don't think that it could be that it's the same thing to take a guitar lesson with a person by internet than in person. And I suspect that there is work on that, or if not, some will be, because some of there are in some. I just find some work on some university precisely thinking about the possibilities of learning by internet and the possibilities of and the constraints. And they pointed something like this sort of things.
Just exploring the possibility that the Durkheimian angle might help to answer questions about affordances. Right? I mean, certainly, if you think of the presentation of an opera in 18th century or 17th century, 18th. I mean, it lives or dies on whether there is a collective effervescence, right? Just, first performance, no effervescence, it's dead in the water, pretty much, right? I mean, is it possible that if we look at affordance, if we look at effervescences in small scale ways also, which is the work of the sociologist Randall Collins, which I would recommend, that affordances are established through sort of micro effervescences. I mean, you have some small number of people or a larger number of people, I mean, who come together and experience a kind of joint affective experience that establishes, I mean, for Durkheim, of course, this was the basis of totemism, right? But, in a more modern world, it doesn't have to be about totemism. It could be more broadly an affordance. I mean, we could talk about whether totemism was affordances also, right? I mean, but we don't have to, right? I mean, if I think to answer Julian's question, we might want to explore whether, in fact, yes, affordances are established on a kind of neo-Durkheimian basis that does involve a kind of, ritualistic, micro-ritualistic experience of a social effervescence, which I think could be understood in your terms and as a form of entrainment.
Somebody else? No? Okay, so
Okay.
thank you very much.
Welcome.
Come to the front, take a picture.
Para decirme que no